Chapter 13. The Heat in the Kitchen. If you can't stand the heat, you better get out of the kitchen. A favorite Truman saying. 1. Exactly when Truman made up his mind to run for re-election is not known. Several times in 1947 he expressed reluctance to face another 4 years in the White House, this goldfish bowl, and again he considered the idea of Eisenhower as the ideal candidate for the Democrats. He would groom the general to follow him, Truman said privately. But when once more he broached the subject to Eisenhower early in 1947, Eisenhower again declined, saying he had no political ambitions. Not that he was not a Democrat. According to Secretary of the Army Kenneth C. Royal, Truman even offered to go on the ticket with Eisenhower as vice president if Eisenhower so desired. Mr. Truman was a realist and from time to time doubted whether he could win in 1948, Royal later explained. Eisenhower was the most popular man in America. To judge by the polls, he had only to nod his head and the presidency was his. Except for the reward of service, Truman told Secretary of Defense Forrestal, he had found little satisfaction in being president. Bess would give everything to be out of the White House, and he and Bess both regretted greatly the constrictions on Margaret's life. No man in his right mind, Truman wrote to his sister in November 1947, would ever wish to be president if he knew what it entailed. Aside from the impossible administrative burden, he has to take all sorts of abuse from liars and demagogues. The people can never understand why the president does not use his supposedly great power to make them behave. Well, all the president is a glorified public relations man who spends his time flattering, kissing, and kicking people to get them to do what they are supposed to do anyway. President Truman did not want to run in 1948, John Steelman later said emphatically. Yet to others equally close day to day it was clear the job agreed with him, and they were certain he would never willingly abandon it. The whole pattern of his life had been a succession of increasingly difficult tests of his capacity to prove equal to tasks seemingly too large for him. Nor had he failed to meet this latest and greatest of tests. The feelings of inadequacy that had so troubled him after Roosevelt's death were by now past. He liked being in charge. It showed in his face and in the way he carried himself. He was a picture of health, his color good, his weight 175, blood pressure 120 to 128 over 80, which was considered excellent. He still took his daily walks and still at his old Army pace of 120 steps a minute, although lately, with the press of events, he often went in the evening instead of early morning. He would complain at times of the falderall of the presidency, but unquestionably he enjoyed the power of the office and its trappings, the limousines, the yacht, the airplane, the special railroad car, as any vital, ambitious man would. The abuse he complained of to his sister was something he had long ago learned to live with. As Cabell Phillips of the New York Times would recall, Truman was blessed with a tough hide and a secure conscience so that he could roll with the punches. He responded with simple and exuberant delight to the flattery and deference that were showered upon him wherever he went in public life. And he did indeed value the reward of service in the presidency, as in every office he had held since entering public life. A career politician, he had attained the summit of his profession, and if it was fate that put him there, then that was all the more reason to win it now on his own merits. The greatest ambition Harry Truman had, according to Clark Clifford, was to get elected in his own right. Having kept so silent and so uncharacteristically detached during the off-year elections in 1946, only to see his party and himself humiliated, Truman now relished the prospect of taking on the Republicans in an all-out, full-scale championship fight, as he said. He was nothing if not a partisan politician, and this was the fight he simply could not walk away from. He had much he wished still to accomplish, and he knew how quickly his own and New Deal programs, the liberal gains of 16 years, could be undone by a Republican president and a Republican Congress. He felt it his duty to get into the fight and help stem the tide of reaction, as he later wrote. They, the Republicans, do not understand the worker, the farmer, the everyday person. Most of them honestly believed that prosperity actually began at the top and would trickle down in due time to benefit all the people. He saw himself battling as Jefferson had against the Federalists, or Jackson staging a revolution against the forces of reaction. In the long line of Republicans who had occupied the White House, he admired but two, Lincoln for his concern for the common man, Theodore Roosevelt for his progressive policies. To Truman, Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt were the giants of the century, and he had no choice, he felt, but to fight for the democratic heritage that had been passed on to him. What I wanted to do personally for my own comfort and benefit was not important. What I could do to contribute to the welfare of the country was important. I had to enter the 1948 campaign for the presidency. So, by late autumn 1947, it was well known within the official family that he was in the race, and by the start of the new year, nearly everyone in Washington had concluded he was running, and that therefore just about anything he did or said was with that in mind, starting with his State of the Union address. The speech, an uncompromising reaffirmation of his liberal program, delivered before Congress on Wednesday, January 7, 1948, evoked little applause and little praise afterward. The Republicans, as anticipated, did not like it at all, any more than did the Southern Democrats. In less than an hour at the podium, Truman called again for a national health insurance program, a massive housing program, increased support for education, increased support for farmers, the conservation of natural resources, and a raise in the minimum wage from 40 to 75 cents an hour. To compensate for rising prices, he proposed a poor man's tax cut, whereby each taxpayer would be allowed to deduct $40 for himself and for each dependent from his final tax bill. Tom Pendergast had paid $2 a vote, exclaimed the Republican chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, Harold Knudsen, and now Truman proposes to pay $40. Further, Truman announced he would be sending Congress a special message on civil rights. Our first goal, he said, is to secure fully the essential human rights of our citizens. The distress among Southern Democrats was considerable. 3 weeks later, on February 2, 1948, without conferring with his congressional leaders, he sent the Civil Rights message. Based on the findings of his own Civil Rights Commission, it was the strongest such program that had ever been proposed by a president. Indeed, until now there had never been a special message on civil rights. Not all Americans were free of violence, it began. Not all groups are free to live and work where they please or to improve their conditions of life by their own efforts. Not all groups enjoy the full privileges of citizenship. The federal government has a clear duty to see that the constitutional guarantees of individual liberties and of equal protection under the laws are not denied or abridged anywhere in the Union. That duty is shared by all three branches of the government, but it can be filled only if the Congress enacts modern, comprehensive civil rights laws adequate to the needs of the day and demonstrating our continuing faith in the free way of life. Truman called for a federal law against the crime of lynching, against which I cannot speak too strongly. He wanted more effective statutory protection of the right to vote everywhere in the country, a law against the poll taxes that prevailed in 7 states of the Old South, the establishment of a Fair Employment Practices Commission with authority to stop discrimination by employers and labor unions alike, an end to discrimination in interstate travel by rail, bus, and airplane. He announced also that he had asked the Secretary of Defense to look into discrimination in the military services and to see it was stopped as soon as possible. In a final request, he asked Congress to act on the claims made by Americans of Japanese descent who, during the war, had been forced from their homes and kept in confinement solely because of their racial origin, claims that would not be met until 45 years later. It was a brave revolutionary declaration, given the reality of entrenched discrimination and the prevailing attitudes of white Americans nearly everywhere in the country, but especially in the South, where the social status and legal place of black citizens had advanced not at all in more than half a century. That Truman believed in both the spirit and the specifics of the message, there is no question. Asked at a press conference a few days later what he had drawn on for background, he replied, "The Constitution and the Bill of Rights." Whether the message was good or bad politics in the year 1948 was a matter of opinion. Clark Clifford was certain the president was doing the right thing morally and politically. To boss Ed Flynn of the Bronx, who was no less concerned about losing the black vote in New York than he had been in 1944, it was extremely welcome news. But the angry outcry on the Hill suggested that if Truman meant what he said, he was finished in the South and therefore in November as well. Southern congressmen lashed out in language often too raw to print. Harlem, it was said, had more influence with this administration than all the white South. Tom Connally of Texas, an old Truman ally in the Senate, called the message a lynching of the Constitution and vowed the South would not take it lying down. Senator Olin Johnston of South Carolina boycotted the annual Jefferson-Jackson Day dinner at the Statler Hotel, where Truman was the guest of honor, because, as Johnston explained to reporters, he and his wife might be seated beside a Negra. As it was, the 3 black Democrats attending the dinner were at a table in the rear. When several Southern Democrats, meeting privately with the president, suggested all would turn out well if he softened his views, Truman, in a written reply, said his own forebears were Confederates and he came from a part of Missouri where Jim Crowism still prevailed. But my very stomach turned over when I learned that Negro soldiers, just back from overseas, were being dumped out of Army trucks in Mississippi and beaten. Whatever my inclinations as a native of Missouri might have been, as president, I know this is bad. I shall fight to end evils like this. On racial matters, Truman had not entirely outgrown his background. Old biases, old habits of speech continued, surfacing occasionally off stage, as some of his aides and Secret Service agents would later attest. Privately, he could still speak of niggers, as if that were the way one naturally referred to blacks. His own sister told Jonathan Daniels that Harry was no different than ever on the subject. Daniels, who had gone to Missouri to gather material for a biography of the president, recorded in his notes that as Mary Jane drove him south from Independence to Grandview one morning, she turned and said, "Harry is no more for nigger equality than any of us," a statement Daniels, as a Southerner, found reassuring. But Mary Jane, like others, failed to understand that Truman knew now, if they did not, that as president he could no longer sit idly by and do nothing in the face of glaring injustice. The findings of his Civil Rights Commission, in a landmark report entitled "To Secure These Rights," had been a shocking revelation. When a friend from out home wrote to advise him to go easy on civil rights, appealing to Truman as a fellow Southerner, Truman took time to answer privately and at length. "The main difficulty with the South is that they are living 80 years behind the times, and the sooner they come out of it, the better it will be for the country and themselves. I am not asking for social equality because no such things exist, but I am asking for equality of opportunity for all human beings, and as long as I stay here, I'm going to continue that fight. When the mob gangs can take 4 people out and shoot them in the back and everybody in the surrounding country is acquainted with who did the shooting and nothing is done about it, that country is in a pretty bad fix from the law enforcement standpoint. When a mayor and the city marshal can take a Negro sergeant off a bus in South Carolina, beat him up and put out one of his eyes, and nothing is done about it by the state authorities, something is radically wrong with the system. On the Louisiana and Arkansas Railway, when coal-burning locomotives were used, the Negro firemen were the thing because it was a back-breaking job and a dirty one. As soon as they turned to oil as a fuel, it became customary for people to take shots at Negro firemen, and a number were murdered because it was thought that this was now a white-collar job and should go to a white man. I can't approve of such goings-on, and I shall never approve of it, as long as I am here. I'm going to try to remedy it, and if that ends up in my failure to be re-elected, that failure will be in a good cause." The murder of 4 blacks by mob gunfire, referred to in the letter, had occurred in Monroe, Georgia, in July 1946. 2 men and their wives were dragged from a car and gunned down so savagely their bodies were scarcely identifiable. One of the victims, Truman knew from the report of his commission, had been a newly returned war veteran, and this, like the account of the men dumped from the truck in Mississippi, and of the young black sergeant Isaac Woodward, who had been pulled from a bus in Batesburg, South Carolina, and brutally beaten and blinded by police, made an everlasting impression on Truman, moving him in a way no statistics ever would have. The wonderful, wonderful development in those years, Clark Clifford would reflect long afterward, was Harry Truman's capacity to grow. Of all the president's aides and cabinet officers, no one had done more than Clifford to push for a strong stand on civil rights as part of a larger effort to, in Clifford's words, strike for new high ground whenever confronting the Republican Congress. And it was strategy based on close study, no less than moral conviction. For Clifford did nothing without careful preparation and planning. On the golf course he was known as someone never to play behind if it could be avoided, since he took so many practice swings before every shot. A special confidential report had been prepared on the politics of 1948, a document of 32 single-spaced typewritten pages prepared by a young Washington attorney and former Roosevelt aide named James A. Rowe, Jr., who had been talking with labor leaders, professional politicians, and newspaper people. It was a political forecast, with suggestions based, as Rowe stressed, solely on appraisal of the politically advantageous thing to do. Because Roe was a law partner of Thomas Corcoran, the influential Tommy the Cork, whom Truman so disliked, Clifford decided not to tell Truman of Roe's part in the report, but to submit it as his own. And with some editing and added refinements by Clifford and George Elsey, it was perceived as, if not exactly a blueprint for the Democrats in 1948, then a guide to navigation. That Roe's authorship was so brushed aside then and later distressed Roe very little. Such was the nature of the system. This is, as you know, a typical and acceptable White House staff technique, he would write to a political scholar years later, and one which I followed in the days when I was administrative assistant to President Roosevelt. Who got the credit was not the point. They were all there to serve the president. Roosevelt especially had preferred people working for him to be equipped with a passion for anonymity. In the Roosevelt and Truman years, George Elsey would remember, staff was staff. The Republican nominee, Roe predicted, would be Dewey, and Dewey, a resourceful, highly dangerous candidate, would be more difficult to defeat than in 1944. To win, the Democrats had to carry the West and the farm vote. Labor would have to be cajoled, flattered, and educated, not because Labor might vote Republican, but because Labor might stay home on Election Day. The Liberals, on the other hand, had to be fed idealism. For while few in number, the Liberals, like the manufacturers and financiers in the Republican ranks, were extremely influential. The businessman has influence because he contributes money. The Liberal exerts influence because he is articulate. The black vote was crucial. A theory of many professional politicians, Roe reported, is that the Northern Negro vote today holds the balance of power in presidential elections for the simple arithmetical reason that the Negroes not only vote in a block but are geographically concentrated in the pivotal, large, and closely contested electoral states, such as New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan. Unless the administration made a determined campaign to help the Negro, Roe insisted, the Negro vote was already lost. No candidate since 1876, except Woodrow Wilson in 1916, had won the presidency without carrying New York, and crucial to New York, along with the black vote, was the Jewish vote, concentrated in New York City. But unless the Palestine issue was boldly and favorably handled by the administration, the Jewish vote was certain to go to the alert Dewey or to Henry Wallace. Housing and high prices would be the chief domestic issue. The foreign policy issue, of course, would be American relations with the Soviet Union, and according to Roe, there was considerable political advantage to the administration in its battle with the Kremlin. The Cold War made good election year politics. In times of crises, the American citizen tends to back up his president, and on the issue of policy toward Russia, President Truman is comparatively invulnerable to attack because of his brilliant appointment of General Marshall, who has convinced the public that as Secretary of State he is nonpartisan and above politics. In a flank attack tied up with foreign policy, the Republicans are trying to identify the administration with domestic communists. The president adroitly stole their thunder by initiating his own government employee loyalty investigation procedure, and the more frank Republicans admit it, but their efforts will intensify as the election approaches. Leadership in the Democratic Party was moribund or worse. It had been so long in power that it was fat, tired, and even a bit senile. The old boss-run machines were a shambles. The president appeared to be liked by the American people. They know that he is a sincere and humble man, and, in the cliché often heard, that he is a man trying to do his best. The problem was the people saw him still as fundamentally a politician, and the politician as such did not hold first place in the ranks of American heroes. The public picture of the president, unfortunately, was not sufficiently varied. The people wanted more in a chief executive. To resolve the problem, Roe suggested that Truman be seen less in the company of politicians, and more often with such interesting people as famous scientists and best-selling authors. Further, the president should divest himself as rapidly as possible of any remnants of the Missouri gang. Roe, and subsequently Clifford in the final version of the report, proposed that Truman invite Albert Einstein to lunch at the White House, that Truman, as a matter of routine, be seen and photographed with not less than 2 interesting, admirable, non-political figures per week. Most important of all, the president must be seen more by the people. He must get away from Washington, travel the country. Since he is president, he cannot be politically active until after the July convention. So a president who is also a candidate must resort to subterfuges, for he cannot sit silent. He must be in the limelight. He must resort to the kind of trip which Roosevelt made famous in the 1940 campaign, the inspection tour. No matter how much the opposition press pointed out the political overtones of those trips, the people paid little attention because what they saw was the head of state performing his duties. In several respects, the report was decidedly mistaken. There was the assumption, for example, that Truman would agree to an idea like inviting Einstein to lunch. Truman had no patience with such public relations gimmickry. It would be synthetic and out of character, and he wouldn't do it, he told Clifford. Nor was he about to cashier Harry Vaughan or Wallace Graham in order to enhance his standing in the public eye. But more striking was Roe's mistaken confidence that the Solid South would remain loyal to the Democratic Party. It was, he said, inconceivable that any policies initiated by the administration, no matter how liberal, could so alienate the South it would revolt in an election year. As always, the South can be considered safely Democratic, and in formulating national policy, it can be safely ignored. Since the Republicans controlled Congress, and since the Southern Democrats who went along with the Republicans time and again were not about to change their attitudes, there was no reason to try to placate either faction. "We were telling the president," Roe later recalled, "you can't get anything done up there on the Hill, so in effect you want to send all the legislation you can up there and then give them hell for not doing anything about it." How much real influence the memorandum had on Truman is impossible to measure. Probably it was relatively little, certainly less than later claimed. According to Roe, who was told by James Webb, Truman kept it in the bottom drawer of his desk and read it every once in a while. But others would insist the memorandum made little if any impression on Truman, since he already knew most of the best that was in it. To a politician of Harry Truman's experience and resourcefulness, remembered Robert Donovan of the New York Herald Tribune, the famous political memorandum would have been a primer. And in any event, Truman would be running the campaign his own way, according to his own ideas, his own political instincts. As things developed, the boycotting of the Jefferson-Jackson Day dinner by Senator Johnston was only a mild preview of Southern outrage. 52 Southern Democrats in Congress pledged themselves to fight any civil rights program in the Democratic platform, and by implication any Democratic candidate for president who advocated such heinous liberal ideas. There were threats of a white Southern march on Washington, and Governor J. Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, speaking for a committee of Southern governors, pledged to defend white supremacy and warned the leadership of the Democratic Party that the South was no longer in the bag. The Mississippi Democratic Committee said it would withdraw from the National Convention unless anti-Southern laws were rejected. Truman took all this very calmly. Then, on March 8th, without fanfare, Senator J. Howard McGrath, Bob Hannigan's replacement as national chairman, announced formally that the president was in the fight for re-election, adding also that the president's position on civil rights remained unchanged. Immediately, Alabama's Senators Lister Hill and John Sparkman, two of the South's most liberal voices in Congress and old friends of Harry Truman, called on him to withdraw and said they would give him no support at the convention. Clearly, a Southern rebellion of major proportions was underway. Troubles of an entirely different nature were besetting Truman, meantime, some minor, even trivial, yet conspicuous and time-consuming just the same. A huge stir of disapproval and ridicule, editorial indignation, jokes, cartoons, had erupted when he announced a plan to add a new balcony to the south portico of the White House, extending from his upstairs oval study so that he and his family could enjoy some outside breathing space with a degree of privacy. It would mean the first major change in the mansion since the time of Andrew Jackson, when the north portico was added. The balcony project was Truman's own idea, and to his extreme annoyance it met with instant disapproval from the Fine Arts Commission, as well as a large part of the press. He was called Back Porch Harry and accused of meddling with a structure that not only didn't belong to him, but that he was not likely to be occupying much longer. Republicans were delighted as the Truman balcony became an overnight sensation. Truman, his temper up, stood his ground, arguing that Jefferson himself had used just such upstairs galleries or balconies in his columned buildings at the University of Virginia. The Washington Star expressed gratitude that the president had never seen the Taj Mahal or the old Mumien Pagoda, or he might have had even more outrageous notions. The balcony would make the White House look right, Truman insisted. It would do away with the need for the unsightly awnings used in summer to shade the mansion's downstairs rooms on the south side. The awnings, you will remember, were attached about halfway up the beautiful columns, and looked always as if they'd caught all the grime and dirt in town, he wrote to his sister. Had to be renewed every year at a cost of $780 and cost $2,000 a year in upkeep. In 8 years, the portico will be paid for in awning cost, and the White House from the south will look as it should. On his morning walks, when approaching the White House from the south side, he hated the sight of the dirty awnings, the way they put the beautiful columns out of proportion. He would go ahead with this balcony, and that was that. To compound his concerns over the old house, he was informed discreetly by head usher Howell Krim that the whole second floor was in imminent danger of falling down. After close examination, an engineer told Truman the ceiling in the state dining room was staying in place largely from force of habit. Charlie Ross was in a fury because Harry Vaughn insisted on making his own announcements to the press. The soft-spoken, thoughtful press secretary and the Falstaffian military aide had come to dislike one another more and more. Ross was terrifically upset, warning there had to be a showdown. It had to be either Vaughn or himself, recorded Eben Ayers. Wallace Graham, the president's physician, was accused of gambling in grain futures at the very time the president had denounced commodity speculation as a contributing cause of inflation, and the implications were that Graham had benefited from inside information. Though at first Graham insisted he had lost his socks in the market, he eventually admitted to having made a profit of $6,000 on an investment of $5,700. Nonetheless, he, like Harry Vaughn, remained on duty at the White House, and the more the press deplored their presence, the more Truman dug in his heels. "You can guard yourself against the wiles of your enemies," Ross observed ruefully to Ayers, "but not the stupidity of your friends." Henry Wallace, meantime, was crusading up and down the country and drawing huge crowds. His followers included ardent young liberals, working people, blacks, and conspicuously members of the American Communist Party. Attacking the Democrats and Republicans alike for their internal rot, Wallace proposed turning America's atomic weapons over to the United Nations and called for a massive reconstruction program for the Soviet Union to be financed by the United States. He repudiated the Marshall Plan as a Marshall Plan. He talked of nationalizing the country's coal mines and railroads. Truman's political strategists worried that the effect of the Wallace movement on Democratic loyalties could do more damage than defections in the South. But above all, it was the urgent problem of what to do about Palestine that troubled Truman. Reflecting on her father's White House years long afterward, Margaret Truman would call this in some ways his most difficult dilemma of all. 2. The issue was complicated, baffling, and charged with emotion. Explosive, as Truman said, and in the heated climate of an election year, exceedingly sensitive. Its consequences in human terms, for the Jewish people, the Arab Palestinians, in its effect on Middle Eastern relations, could clearly be momentous and very far-reaching. Truman felt pulled in several directions. Like the great majority of Americans, he wanted to do what was right for the hundreds of thousands of European Jews, survivors of the Holocaust who had suffered such unimaginable horrors. His sympathy for them was heartfelt and deep-seated. As senator, at the mass meeting in Chicago in 1943, he had said everything humanly possible must be done to provide a haven for Jewish survivors of the Nazis. Often as senator, he had personally assured Zionist leaders he would fight for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. As president, he was further impressed by the report of an emissary sent the summer of 1945 to investigate displaced person camps in Europe and talk to Jewish survivors. Earl G. Harrison, dean of the University of Pennsylvania Law School and former U.S. Commissioner of Immigration, had supplied Truman with an exceedingly moving document describing misery that, as Truman said, could not be allowed to continue. And it reinforced his own belief that Palestine was the answer. Palestine, reported Harrison, was definitely and preeminently the choice of the Jewish survivors in Europe. Only in Palestine would they be welcomed and find peace and quiet and be given an opportunity to live and work. No other single matter is, therefore, so important from the viewpoint of Jews in Germany and Austria and those elsewhere who have known the horrors of concentration camps as is the disposition of the Palestine question. The two ardent champions of the Jewish cause on the White House staff were Clark Clifford and David K. Niles, Truman's special assistant for minority affairs. Niles, one of the holdovers from the Roosevelt years and himself a Jew, sensed in Truman a fundamental sympathy for the plight of the Jews that he had never felt with Roosevelt. Had Roosevelt lived, Niles later said, things might not have turned out as they did. Niles was a short, dark, round-faced, nearsighted man with a receding hairline, as unremarkable in appearance as Clifford was striking, and an extremely shrewd, experienced political troubleshooter, with long-standing contacts among Jewish leaders in every part of the country. To White House reporters, as to others on the White House staff, he seemed oddly secretive, even mysterious, spending long weekends in New York with theater people, or in Boston, his hometown. It was a reputation Niles cultivated. His own passion for anonymity verged on being a mania. "I am a man of no importance," he would insist quietly. In his tiny, cluttered office on the second floor of the old State Department building next door, he spent most of his time on the telephone. Between them, Niles and Clifford would keep key Zionists informed of what was going on in Washington and within the White House at almost every step. Both men were keenly attuned to the politics of the Palestine issue, though Clifford vehemently objected to any charges, then or later, that the November election was the real heart of the matter, that it was all just politics to get the Jewish vote. Support for a Jewish homeland was, of course, extremely good politics in 1948, possibly crucial in such big states as Pennsylvania or Illinois, and especially in New York, where there were 2.5 million Jews. More important even than Jewish votes to the destitute Democratic Party could be Jewish campaign contributions. Nor was there any doubt that the Republicans stood ready to do all they could for the Jewish cause, and for the same reasons. But beyond the so-called Jewish vote, there was the country at large, where popular support for a Jewish homeland was overwhelming. As would sometimes be forgotten, it was not just American Jews who were stirred by the prospect of a new nation for the Jewish people. It was most of America. Politics and humanitarian concerns and foreign policy were all closely, irrevocably intertwined. Yet for Truman, unquestionably, humanitarian concerns mattered foremost. His sympathies were naturally with the underdog, but he was influenced, too, by a lifelong love of ancient history, his own remarkable grasp of the whole complicated chronicle of the Fertile Crescent. For Truman, Palestine was never just a place on the map. And his own reading of ancient history and the Bible made him a supporter of the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, Clifford remembered, even when others who were sympathetic to the plight of the Jews were talking of sending them to places like Brazil. He did not need to be convinced by Zionists. In fact, he had to work hard to avoid the appearance of yielding to Zionist pressure. I remember him talking once about the problems of displaced persons. "Everyone else who's been dragged from his country has some place to go back to," he said, "but the Jews have no place to go." To Truman, as he himself wrote, it was a basic human problem. When his Secretary of Defense, Forrestal, reminded him of the critical need for Saudi Arabian oil in the event of war, Truman said he would handle the situation in the light of justice, not oil. Any implication by Forrestal or officials from the State Department that he somehow failed to appreciate the complexities involved, Truman greatly resented. As president, he could not possibly dismiss the strategic and economic importance to the United States and Europe of the rapidly developing Middle Eastern oil reserves. Like most Americans, he knew relatively little about the Arabs and their culture, but at the same time he had no wish to damage relations with the Arabs, whose hostility to the establishment of a Jewish state in their midst appeared implacable. American relations with the Arab states had been good until now, and like Forrestal, the chiefs of staff, fearing an oil-starved war, put great stress on the importance of maintaining those relations. To the Arabs, it seemed they were being made to pay for the crimes of Hitler. Much blood had already been spilled in Palestine. Arab groups had attacked Jewish settlements. Jewish terrorists had attacked British troops. Zionist leaders had been jailed. In the summer of 1946, the Jewish terrorist group Irgun blew up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, killing 91 people. And while Truman remained sympathetic to the claim of the Jews on Palestine and knew that more than 600,000 Jews were already there, he also knew the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Arabs. As he said many times, he had no wish to send American troops to guarantee the survival of the new Jewish state, and from the advice he was getting, that was exactly what would be required. Also, he found the mounting pressures on him by Jewish organizations extremely vexing. A good listener, he had been listening to their pleas and arguments since his earliest days in office, when Rabbi Stephen Wise first called on him, and he had become not just worn down by it all, but increasingly suspicious, increasingly resentful of the politics of Palestine. In late 1947, the White House received more than 100,000 letters and telegrams concerning Palestine. "Mr. President, it is up to you and the other leaders of the American people to set an example to the rest of the world. Give your support to the Zionist movement, just as the late President Roosevelt would have done," he read in a letter from Brooklyn. A telegram from the Philadelphia Women's Division of the American Jewish Congress said, "Our government is honor-bound by its pleasures and promises and must keep faith with humanity. We must give our leadership and strength for the establishment of a Jewish state." Truman became so exasperated by the flood of Jewish propaganda, he told Senator Claude Pepper, that he took a great stack of such mail and struck a match to it, a claim that may have expressed his true desire but that appears to have no basis in fact. "I don't remember that incident at all," his secretary Rose Conway later told writer Robert Donovan. "What I am trying to do is make the whole world safe for the Jews. Therefore, I don't feel like going to war in Palestine," Truman wrote in response to one Zionist group in a letter he never sent. To Mrs. Roosevelt, whom he had made a delegate to the United Nations, he wrote, "The action of some of our United States Zionists will eventually prejudice everyone against what they are trying to get done. I fear very much that the Jews are like all underdogs. When they get on top, they are just as intolerant and as cruel as the people were to them when they were underneath. I regret this situation very much because my sympathy has always been on their side." When a congressional delegation from New York came to see him about the issue, he sat at his desk irritably shuffling papers and said he wished more people would call on him about the country's problems and not their own. "I am not a New Yorker," he is supposed to have said at another meeting. "All these people are pleading a special interest. I am an American." He abhorred special interests of any kind, but several individuals had begun to get under his skin. Particularly offensive to Truman was the attitude of Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver of Cleveland, who, with Stephen Wise, was co-chairman of the American Zionist Emergency Council. A Republican and close ally of Senator Taft, Rabbi Silver had helped write a pro-Zionist plank in the 1944 Republican platform. At one point during a meeting in Truman's office, Silver had hammered on Truman's desk and shouted at him. "Terror and silver are the cause of some, if not all, of our troubles," Truman later said. And at one cabinet meeting, he reportedly grew so furious over the subject of the Jews that he snapped, "Jesus Christ couldn't please them when he was on earth, so how could anyone expect that I would have any luck?" To his sister Mary Jane, he wrote, "I am so tired and bedeviled I can't be decent to people." When several American diplomats who had been called home from the Middle East to advise him finished presenting the Arab point of view, Truman's comment was that he didn't have a great many Arabs among his constituents. Forrestal's intense, repeated warnings of the importance of Arab oil, Forrestal's bitter opposition to any American action that would favor the Zionist cause, had also begun to play on Truman's nerves. And for his part, Forrestal found himself thinking less and less of a president who seemed so willing to cave in to cheap political expediency. Truman had not, however, shut himself off from Zionist spokesmen or, importantly, from contact with his old friend and former business partner, Eddie Jacobson. Like many American Jews, Jacobson was not a Zionist, but he looked to Zionist leaders to solve the problems of the Jewish refugees, and he had been trying to do his part both for the refugees and for the cause of the Jewish homeland by escorting small groups to the White House to explain the Zionist position. Following one such visit in 1946, when he had accompanied Rabbi Arthur J. Leleveld of New York and Charles Kaplan, the vice president of a shirt company, to see the president, Jacobson quipped to reporters, "Kaplan sells shirts, I sell furnishings, and the rabbi sells notions." Truman was as fond of Jacobson as ever. He knew him to be a devout Jew and a patriotic American and trusted him absolutely, and this was to give Jacobson a role of unusual importance as events unfolded. Until now, Jacobson had asked no favors of Truman or presumed ever to impose on his time. And when the day came when Eddie Jacobson was persuaded to forego his natural reluctance to petition me and he came to talk to me about the plight of the Jews, I paid careful attention, Truman later wrote. Indeed, said Truman, it was a fact of history that Jacobson's contribution was of decisive importance, a point quite unknown at the time. The call to make Palestine a Jewish homeland had begun in the late 19th century, and prominent among American champions of the cause had been Truman's late friend Justice Louis Brandeis, who had helped win Woodrow Wilson's approval of the Zionist dream. In 1917, during the Great War, the British had seized Palestine from the Turks. That same year, in what became known as the Balfour Declaration, the British government formally endorsed the idea of a future Jewish home in Palestine, the ancient kingdom of Israel, a narrow streak on the map at the eastern end of the Mediterranean comprising all of 10,000 square miles, about the size of Sicily or Vermont. The war over, Britain was granted a special mandate over Palestine by the League of Nations, with the understanding that independence would soon follow. But the British mandate had continued. Only after another world war, only in 1947, had the Attlee government announced that it would withdraw from Palestine, as from Greece, and turn the whole thorny issue over to the United Nations. So, in effect, Palestine and the destiny of Europe's displaced Jews was another of those results of World War II, like the bomb and the presence of the Red Army in Eastern Europe, that had been left for Truman to face. American policy, generally speaking, favored immediate independence for Palestine, which would then be divided or partitioned into two separate states, one Jewish, one Arab, joined in an economic union. The United States also supported the idea of large-scale Jewish immigration to the new homeland. Jews everywhere favored partition. The Arab states were vehemently opposed. The British thought the plan unworkable, and though Winston Churchill, at the peak of his power, had championed a Jewish homeland, "I am a Zionist," he had bellowed at a meeting in Cairo in 1944, the Attlee government opposed Jewish immigration to Palestine. To the British, Harry Truman seemed carelessly pro-Zionist. When in 1946 Truman had called for the admission of 100,000 Jews to Palestine, Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin ascribed it to a crude desire for votes in New York and suggested Truman had no wish to see more Jews come to the United States, remarks that set Truman's teeth on edge. The more attention given to the issue, the more divisive it became, dividing Jews from Arabs, British from Americans, and more in Washington threatening to divide the White House from the State Department, where it was strongly felt the Arabs would never accept partition except under force, and might very well turn to the Soviets for help, a move that could bring the Soviets into the Middle East on the pretext of keeping the peace. Like the British, senior officers at the State Department favored a United Nations trusteeship over Palestine until the contention between Arabs and Jews could somehow be resolved. George Kennan considered the Palestine situation insoluble for the time being. More outspoken was the head of the Office of Near Eastern Affairs, Lloyd W. Henderson, a suave, knowledgeable career diplomat with a strong sense of duty who was convinced partition of Palestine had no chance of success. Henderson worried about the consequences to the Marshall Plan should Arab oil be cut off, Europe being dependent on the Arab states for 80% of its oil. The creation of a new Jewish state at this particular moment, he stressed to Marshall, could be disastrous to the long-range interests of the United States. Relations between the State Department and such members of Truman's staff as Clifford and Niles grew extremely difficult. Some White House men still believe that a number of positions taken by career men on this matter were based on anti-Semitism, not diplomacy, Jonathan Daniels was to write, naming no names. And there are men in the State Department who believe that some of the presidential staff were clearly more concerned about Israel in terms of American politics than in terms of American security. If Clifford was reluctant to stress the domestic political stakes involved, Niles was not. Henderson would remember Niles turning to him at one point and saying sharply, "Look here, Loy, the most important thing for the United States is for the president to be re-elected." According to Dean Rusk, who was then Marshall's assistant secretary in charge of UN affairs, the real cause of difficulty was not any deviousness on the part of the State Department, but the conflicting objectives in the president's own mind. This wasn't understood at the time. With Marshall and State working toward a long-range solution, the Zionists branded anyone not 1,000% behind the Zionist cause as having betrayed the president. Clifford remained certain the State Department, to a man, was doing everything possible to thwart the president's intentions, and he told Truman so. Truman thought Clifford unduly concerned. "I know how Marshall feels, and he knows how I feel," Truman said, meaning if Marshall was with him, that was all he needed to know. In Palestine, the whole time, violence and terrorism continued. It was in late 1947, on Saturday, November 29th, over the Thanksgiving weekend, that the United Nations, at the end of a dramatic 2.5-hour session, voted for partition by a narrow margin, the United States taking a lead part behind the scenes to see the measure through. "We went for it," Clifford told Jonathan Daniels. "It was because the White House was for it that it went through." The Soviet Union, too, had joined the United States in support. Eddie Jacobson recorded in telegraphic style his own chronicle of the unfolding drama. November 6th, Washington. President still going all out for Palestine. November 17th, again to White House. Wednesday, 26th, received call from White House, everything okay. November 27th, Thanksgiving, sent 2-page wire to Truman. Friday, received call from his secretary, Matt Connolly, not to worry. November 29th, mission accomplished. Truman, Jacobson noted, had told him that he, Truman, and he alone was responsible for swinging the votes of several delegations. Zionists, Jews everywhere were elated. In the lobby outside the General Assembly, at UN headquarters at Flushing Meadows, in what had been the New York City building at the 1939 World's Fair, the Jewish delegation was swept up in the embrace of delegates and visitors from all but the Arab countries. In the hall itself, while members of the Arab delegations walked out, Zionists in the audience were rejoicing. "This is the day the Lord hath made," a rabbi cried in the delegates' lounge. There were Jews in tears and non-Jews moved by the nobility of the occasion. Nobody who ever lived that moment will ever lose its memory from his heart, recalled Abba Eben, who was then a young liaison officer with the Jewish Agency, the official Zionist organization. To the Zionist Organization of America, the vote was a triumphant vindication of the Zionist dream and a victory for international equity. Rabbi Silver called it a turning point in history and expressed particular appreciation for the part played by both the United States and the Soviet Union. Here, said the New York Herald Tribune, was one of the few great acts of courageous collective statesmanship which our shattered post-war world has been able to achieve. At a Zionist rally in New York to celebrate the occasion, 20,000 people tried to jam into an auditorium on 34th Street, a crowd 3 times the seating capacity. Britain announced that responsibility for Palestine would be turned over to the United Nations in less than 6 months, on May 14, 1948. The Arabs said partition meant war, and Truman was warned by the chiefs of staff that military intervention by the United States to protect a new Jewish state would require no less than 100,000 troops. The British were about to withdraw 50,000 troops. The Arabs, Forrestal told Clifford, would push the Jews into the sea. The hard truth, as Forrestal reported to Truman, was that the deployable troops then available totaled less than 30,000, plus perhaps 23,000 Marines. Nor was Palestine by any means the sole concern in early February 1948. In Czechoslovakia, a violent coup backed by the Red Army had imposed a pro-communist government with bewildering speed. It was one of the traumatic events of the post-war era. A feeling of revulsion swept much of the world, as it had only 10 years before when the Nazis seized Czechoslovakia. Italy and France appeared to be headed for the same fate. Truman left for Key West for another greatly needed rest and change of scene, which, after all, did little to improve his outlook. Things looked black, he told Margaret in a letter from Key West on March 3rd. Russia had kept none of its agreements, so that now we are faced with exactly the same situation with which Britain and France were faced in 1938-39 with Hitler. 2 days later, on March 5th, came a top-secret cable from General Lucius D. Clay in Berlin, reporting a worrisome shift in Soviet attitudes in Berlin, a new tenseness in every Soviet individual with whom we have official relations. Until recently, Clay had felt another war was not likely for at least 10 years. His sense now is that war could come any time and with dramatic suddenness. If, as later suggested, the real purpose of Clay's message was to impress Congress on the need to reinstate the draft, this was not understood at the time, and its effect on Washington was stunning and entirely real. General Bradley said later that it lifted me right out of my chair. Secretary of the Army Royal checked with David Lilienthal to see how long it would take to move atomic bombs to the Mediterranean, closer to Russia. The atmosphere of Washington today, wrote Joseph and Stuart Alsop in their column, is no longer post-war, it is a pre-war atmosphere. The Jewish pressure on the White House did not diminish in the days following the partition vote in the UN, Truman would write years later, bitter still over the memory. Individuals and groups asked me, usually in rather quarrelsome and emotional ways, to stop the Arabs, to keep the British from supporting the Arabs, to furnish American soldiers, to do this, that, and the other. I think I can say that I kept the faith in the rightness of my policy in spite of some of the Jews. Hundreds of thousands of postcards flooded the White House mail, nearly all from Jewish interest groups. Largely as a result of the efforts of the American Zionist Emergency Council, 33 state legislatures passed resolutions favoring a Jewish state in Palestine. 40 governors and more than half the Congress signed petitions to the president. David Niles grew so emotional at one meeting in Truman's office that he threatened to quit unless Truman moved more emphatically in support of the Jewish cause. Ed Flynn came down from New York to tell the president that he must either give in on Palestine or expect New York's opposition to his renomination in July. Truman's patience wore thin. He refused to make further comment on Palestine, refused to see any more Zionist spokesmen, even ruling out a visit from Dr. Chaim Weizmann, the grand old man of world Zionist leaders who, despite failing health, had sailed from London for the expressed purpose of seeing him. Weizmann, a renowned scientist, now 74, had devoted a large part of his life to the dream of a Jewish homeland. Small, charming, and clever, he had been one of the architects of the Balfour Declaration. Also, he and Truman already knew and liked one another. At their first meeting, as Truman remembered him, he had not known how to pronounce Chaim. So I called him Cham. He liked it. He was a wonderful man, one of the wisest people I think I ever met. A leader, one of the kind you read about. They had met secretly in the White House in November 1947, just before the UN vote on partition. The effect on Truman was nearly as pronounced as it had been on the British Foreign Secretary Lord Balfour 30 years earlier. Spreading a map on Truman's desk, Weizmann had fascinated the former Missouri farmer with the agricultural possibilities in the Negev Desert, the future control of which was still at issue. Truman pledged his support for the inclusion of the Negev in the Jewish state. "You can bank on us," Truman had said, and as Weizmann would write with wry understatement, "I was extremely happy to find that the president read the map quickly and clearly." But now Truman had closed the door to the little doctor, and this to Weizmann and his American Zionist allies was an especially distressing sign. Through Clifford and Niles, they already knew in detail what opposition they faced at the State Department. A secret paper from George Kennan's policy planning staff recommended no further support for partition. A report from the new Central Intelligence Agency concluded that partition would not work and urged reconsideration. More important to Truman were the views of George Marshall, who, at a meeting of the National Security Council on February 12th, had said the United States was playing with fire while having nothing with which to put it out. Marshall saw America as gravely threatened by the Soviet Union, and as a soldier he was acutely aware of the vital importance of Middle Eastern oil in the event of a war in Europe, which seemed more likely by the day. Marshall had besides a soldier's distaste for politics. Writing about the Palestine question in a letter to Eleanor Roosevelt, he said candidly that the political situation in this country doesn't help matters. At a press conference, he was still more emphatic. As long as he was Secretary of State, there would be no bending to either political or military threats. Clifford grew increasingly concerned. "On 5 occasions I told the President that our position on Israel was going sour," Clifford recorded. On each time the President replied, "No, Marshall knows how I feel." At the State Department, thousands of letters were received demanding the dismissal of Loy Henderson for being pro-Arab. Henderson was summoned to Truman's office to a meeting attended by Clifford and Niles and asked to defend his position. Henderson felt Clifford and Niles were trying to humiliate him in front of the President. "I pointed out that the views which I had been expressing were those not only of myself," Henderson remembered, "but of all our legations and consular offices in the Middle East and of all members of the Department of State who had responsibilities for that area." The cross-questioning by Clifford and Niles became more and more harsh until finally Truman stood up and said, "Oh, hell, I'm leaving." From his bearing and facial expression, Henderson remembered, I was not at all convinced that even at that late date the President had made the final decision to go all out for the establishment of the Jewish state. Although I was not in a position, of course, to know what his real feelings were, I had the impression that he realized that the Congress, the press, the Democratic Party, and aroused American public opinion in general would turn against him if he should withdraw his support of the Zionist cause. On the other hand, it seemed to me he was worried about what the long-term effect would be on the United States if he should continue to support policies advocated by the Zionists. He was almost desperately hoping, I thought, that the Department of State would tell him that the setting up in Palestine of Arab and Jewish states as proposed by the UN Commission would be in the interest of the United States. This, however, the Department of State thus far had not been able to do. On arriving at New York from London, Chaim Weizmann had taken ill from the strain of events. Every effort to make contact with Truman had failed. Then, late the night of February 20th, as Weizmann lay in his room at the Waldorf Astoria, the president of the National B'nai B'rith, Frank Goldman, put through a call to Eddie Jacobson in Kansas City, getting Jacobson out of bed to ask if he would be willing to help. No one, not even Ed Flynn, could budge the president, Goldman said. In a hurried letter to Truman, Jacobson begged him to see Chaim Weizmann as soon as possible. But in response, in a letter from Key West dated February 27th, Truman said there was nothing new that Weizmann could tell him. The situation, Truman added, was not solvable as presently set up. Jacobson refused to accept defeat. No sooner had Truman returned to Washington than Jacobson arrived from Kansas City. On Saturday, March 13th, without an appointment, he walked into the West Wing of the White House, where, outside Truman's office, Matt Connolly warned him that under no circumstances was he to mention Palestine. Entering Truman's office, shaking hands with his old friend, Jacobson was pleased to see how well he looked. Florida had done him good, Jacobson said. For a while they chatted about their families and Jacobson's business, a subject in which Truman, Jacobson said, always had a brother's interest. They were alone, and with the West Wing largely unoccupied on Saturday, the hush of the room was greater than usual. Jacobson brought up Palestine. Truman, suddenly tense and grim-faced, responded in hard, abrupt fashion, not at all like himself, Jacobson thought. In all the years of our friendship, he never talked to me in this manner, or in any way even approaching it, Jacobson would remember. Truman later told Clark Clifford he was not angry at Jacobson so much as at the people who were using Jacobson to get to him. He had no wish to talk about Palestine or the Jews or the Arabs or the British, Truman said. He would leave that to the United Nations. He spoke bitterly of the abuse he had been subjected to, of how disrespectful and mean certain Jews had been to him. Jacobson thought suddenly and sadly that my dear friend, the President of the United States, was at that moment as close to being an anti-Semite as a man could possibly be. Jacobson tried arguing back. I am now surprised at myself that I had the nerve, he later wrote, but Truman was unmoved. Jacobson felt crushed. On a table to the right against the wall was one of the President's prized possessions, a small bronze of Andrew Jackson on horseback, the model of the statue by Charles Keck that Truman had commissioned for the Jackson County Courthouse in Kansas City. Jacobson had noticed it in other visits, but now, pointing to it, he found himself making an impassioned speech. Harry, all your life you've had a hero. I, too, have a hero, a man I never met, but who is, I think, the greatest Jew who ever lived. I am talking about Chaim Weizmann. He is a very sick man, almost broken in health, but he traveled thousands of miles just to see you and plead the cause of my people. Now you refuse to see him just because you are insulted by some of our American Jewish leaders, even though you know that Weizmann had absolutely nothing to do with these insults and would be the last man to be party to them. It doesn't sound like you, Harry, because I thought you could take this stuff they have been handing out. As Abba Eban later wrote, the comparison between Weizmann and Andrew Jackson was unimaginably far-fetched. And it worked. Truman began drumming his fingers on the desk. He wheeled around in his chair and with his back to Jacobson sat looking out the window into the garden. For what to Jacobson seemed like centuries, neither of them said anything. Then, swinging about and looking Jacobson in the eye, Truman said what Jacobson later described as the most endearing words he had ever heard. You win, you bald-headed son of a bitch. I will see him. From the White House, Jacobson walked directly across Lafayette Square and up 16th Street to the bar at the Statler, where, as never before in his life, he downed 2 double bourbons. On March 16th, the morning papers were filled with rumors of war. Truman's concern was extreme. The Marshall Plan was insufficient to check the Soviet menace. American military strength must also be reestablished, and quickly. It is the most serious situation we have faced since 1939, he wrote to Mrs. Roosevelt. I shall face it with everything I have. He must awaken the Congress and the country. It was better to do that than be caught as we were in the last war without having warned the Congress and the people, he told his staff. On March 17th, the fine, bright St. Patrick's Day in Washington with the forsythia in bloom, he went before a joint session on the Hill to ask for immediate passage of the Marshall Plan, for universal military training still one more time, and for a temporary reenactment of the draft to meet the rapid changes taking place in Europe that threatened national security. It was almost exactly a year since his speech from the same podium announcing the Truman Doctrine. And for the first time now, he identified the Soviet Union as the one nation blocking the way to peace. It was a forceful, historic statement. Since the close of hostilities, World War II, the Soviet Union and its agents have destroyed independence and democratic character of a whole series of nations in Eastern and Central Europe. It is this ruthless course of action and the clear design to extend it to the remaining free nations in Europe that have brought about the critical situation in Europe today. I believe that we have reached the point at which the position of the United States should be made unmistakably clear. There are times in world history when it is far wiser to act than to hesitate. The will to peace, he said, must be backed by the strength for peace. We must be prepared to pay the price for peace, or assuredly we shall pay the price of war. But Congress was fundamentally unmoved. To Arthur Krock of the New York Times, an acknowledged hardliner, Truman deserved great praise for his courage as well as his disregard for political considerations, since calling for the draft in an election year seemed the poorest possible political strategy. Yet to many in the audience, talk of the growing menace of the Russians seemed a blatant election year ploy, and as such a poor one. Frankly, candidly, wrote Richard Strout in the New Republic, we think Harry Truman is licked. We don't think any crisis atmosphere will elect him. A new Gallup poll indicated that almost irrespective of what Truman might or might not do, he would lose in November to any of four possible Republican nominees: Dewey, Vandenberg, former Governor Harold E. Stassen of Minnesota, and General Douglas MacArthur. The simple fact is that Truman isn't the type of man to whom folks turn in time of national danger, concluded Strout. The idea of Truman as a man on horseback is just funny. Shortly after dark on the evening of Thursday, March 18th, to avoid being seen by reporters, Chaim Weizmann was ushered quietly into the White House by way of the East Wing. Truman, who had not informed the State Department of what he was up to, insisted the meeting be kept secret. Eddie Jacobson, by now a familiar face to the White House press, had agreed to stay away. According to later accounts by both Truman and Weizmann, the meeting went well. They talked for 3/4 of an hour. Truman said he wanted to see justice done without bloodshed and assured Weizmann that the United States would support partition. And when he left my office, Truman would write, I felt that he had received a full understanding of my policy and that I knew what it was he wanted. Recalling the event years later, Truman would also remember Eddie Jacobson being present, but then, in a sense, he was. The situation, however, had become more complicated than Weizmann knew, or than Truman himself seems to have understood, as would be revealed quite dramatically in less than 24 hours. And Truman was partly, if unintentionally, to blame for what happened. He had not only neglected to tell Secretary Marshall or anyone at the State Department of Weizmann's visit and what had transpired, possibly because Marshall was on the West Coast, or more likely because he refused to accept the possibility that he and Marshall might be working at cross purposes. But he seems to have wholly misjudged the reaction of Jewish groups to the abrupt reversal of American policy that he himself had tacitly sanctioned several weeks before while in Key West, and that his own ambassador to the UN, former Senator Warren Austin, now presented without warning on Friday, March 19th, the very day after Truman and Weizmann reached their understanding. To give all sides in the Palestine controversy time to cool down, Austin announced before the General Assembly the United States recommended abandoning the partition plan and called for a temporary UN trusteeship over Palestine. It was a complete, seemingly inexplicable turnabout by the administration, and for Jews everywhere shattering, almost unbelievable news. The American Jewish Congress, in an emergency meeting, charged the State Department with conduct both un-American and thoroughly dishonorable. On Capitol Hill there were cries of sellout. No more shameful decision in international politics had ever been made, charged Congressman Emanuel Seller, Democrat from New York, while a Democratic senator who chose to remain anonymous predicted that the antagonism of Jews in those states where their number was greatest could produce a revolt at the polls in November, every bit as damaging to Truman as the anti-Catholic movement had been to Al Smith in 1928. The New York Times accused the administration of unprecedented ineptness and of caving into base material concerns. A land of milk and honey now flows with oil, and the homeland of three great religions is having its fate decided by expediency without a sign of the spiritual and ethical considerations which should be determining at least in that part of the world. Ancient Palestine was once described as not the land of philosophers but the home of prophets. It would take a prophet sitting on a rapidly spinning turntable to have foreseen the course which our government has pursued during the last few months. The White House was deluged with letters, telegrams, and petitions to the president filled with alarm and outrage over such whimsical and cynical action, such vacillating and disastrous policy. Nor were they all from Jews or Jewish organizations. This change can mean nothing but the complete annihilation of that wonderful home-loving race of people who have demonstrated the wonders they can accomplish in that country which actually before God and man belongs to them, wrote a municipal court judge from Council Bluffs, Iowa named John P. Tinley. They must not be betrayed. For God's sake and the sake of humanity, do something to correct this terrible blunder. Oh, how could you stoop so low, declared Professor Samuel A. Sloan of the Carnegie Institute of Technology in Pittsburgh. Was your action of Friday a gentleman's agreement with England and the Arab interests? This revolting move must and should be the death of the United Nations. Won't you stop trying to be a statesman and act like a human being? For Eddie Jacobson in Kansas City, March 19th was Black Friday. People enraged over the news kept calling him all day. How did he feel now that his friend Truman had turned out to be a traitor to the Jewish people? There wasn't one who expressed faith and confidence in the word of the President of the United States, remembered Jacobson, who felt so heartsick he had to take to his bed for the remainder of the weekend. Not until Monday, when he was back at the store, did Jacobson hear from Chaim Weizmann, who called personally to tell him not to despair. Weizmann, who had more right than anyone to feel betrayed, was certain the President had meant what he said when they met. Jacobson must not forget, Weizmann stressed, that his friend Harry S. Truman was the single most powerful man in the world, and it was up to Jacobson to keep the White House door open. Truman's first news of what had happened at the United Nations came in the morning papers, Saturday the 20th, the day after Austin's speech. At 7:30 a.m., Truman was on the phone to Clifford at his home, telling him to get down to the White House immediately. "This morning I find that the State Department has reversed my Palestine policy," Truman wrote in a fury on his calendar. "The first I know about it is what I see in the papers. Isn't that hell? I'm now in the position of a liar and a double-crosser. I never felt so in my life. There are people on the third and fourth levels of the State Department who have always wanted to cut my throat. They are succeeding in doing it." Still unable to accept the idea that it might be Marshall who was opposing his position, or who misunderstood his position, he saw the State Department itself, the striped pants boys, as the perpetrators of his troubles. "Truman was in his office as disturbed as I have ever seen him," Clifford remembered. "I don't understand this," he said. "How could this have happened? I assured Chaim Weizmann he must think I'm a shit-ass." The President's statement that the action at the UN had come without his knowledge seemed incredible, wrote Eben Ayers after an emergency staff meeting. The political effect may be terrifically bad, and it seemed impossible to believe that those responsible for the action could not have realized the reaction that would result. Calling a press conference in Los Angeles that evening, Secretary Marshall said he regarded trusteeship over Palestine as the wisest course. He himself had recommended it to the President, Marshall said, and the President had approved. The statement was brief, unadorned, accurate, and helped Truman not at all. Marshall flew home the following day, Sunday the 21st, and on Monday the 22nd at the White House, he and Loy Henderson met with a calmer, more composed President, who now, in obvious deference to Marshall, said he had given approval to the idea of trusteeship as an intermediate step, and that it was only the timing of Austin's speech that had upset him. But as he came out of the meeting, Truman was heard to mutter, "This gets us nowhere." The fact was he had also specified earlier that nothing be done before the General Assembly that could be taken as a retreat from the partition plan. Further, he had insisted he be shown Austin's speech in advance. "Send final draft of Austin's remarks for my consideration," he had directed on February 22nd, which clearly the State Department had not done. As Charlie Ross observed in his diary, no pronouncement of the momentous nature of Austin's should have been made without prior consultation with the President or someone on his staff. But as Ross also observed, it would be unthinkable now for Truman to disavow what Austin had said. Though Truman made none of these points to Marshall, he felt them acutely, as he felt still that it was those below Marshall who were determined to sabotage his policy, the striped pants conspirators, as he now referred to them in a letter to his sister. At a press conference, speaking anything but plainly, he said trusteeship did not necessarily prejudice the character of the final political settlement. Was he then in favor still of partition at some future date? That is what I am trying to say here as plainly as I can. He was straddling, obfuscating. He knew it, the reporters knew it, and he felt miserable. It was one of the worst messes of my father's career, Margaret would attest, and he could do nothing but suffer. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote to submit her resignation as a delegate to the United Nations, while two of her sons, Franklin Jr. and Elliot, joined a disparate but growing number of worried Democrats who wanted to draft General Eisenhower for the presidential nomination. Truman refused to accept Mrs. Roosevelt's resignation and paid no attention to her sons. On April 9th, writing to the President from New York, Chaim Weizmann, after thanking Truman for the personal kindness which you have so often shown me, and for the sympathetic interest which you have constantly devoted to the cause of our people, stressed the gravity of the moment and Truman's own historic role in it. "The choice for our people, Mr. President, is between statehood and extermination. History and Providence have placed this issue in your hands, and I am confident that you will yet decide it in the spirit of moral law." On Saturday afternoon, April 11th, to avoid the few reporters hanging about the White House, Eddie Jacobson slipped in through the East Wing. Again, Truman reaffirmed, and very strongly according to Jacobson, what he had told Weizmann. Moreover, he now assured Jacobson he would recognize the new Jewish state. And to this, wrote Jacobson later, he agreed with his whole heart. Harry Truman had made up his mind. As the likelihood of war breaking out in Palestine grew more ominous and the time before the British withdrawal grew shorter, tension at the White House increased measurably, and the strain on the President himself did not go unnoticed. The President, wrote David Lilienthal after a meeting on April 21st, looked worn, as I haven't seen him look since I have known him. There was never enough time. There was always more than one reasonable, prudent course of action to take. Nothing seemed simple. At Griffith Stadium, throwing out the first ball at the start of the new baseball season, at a Senators-Yankees game, the ambidextrous President seemed hesitant even about which arm to use, then threw with his left. News accounts described him as whirling about Washington. Not once, but twice, Truman had tootled off to the National Gallery to see a collection of paintings by the old masters discovered by the American Third Army in a salt mine in Germany. He attended the Gridiron Dinner, another rite of spring, and the funeral of a veteran White House clerk, Maurice C. Latta, who had been employed since 1898. From a flag-festooned platform on Constitution Avenue, he reviewed an Army Day parade and later at the White House welcomed the very nervous young Prince Regent of Belgium with a state dinner. At the nearby Loew's Capitol Theater, accompanied by Bess and Margaret, he saw the premiere of Frank Capra's new movie, State of the Union, starring Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn, which gave him a lift as nothing had in a long while. "It is a scream," he wrote to Mary Jane. "If you get a chance, go see it. It gives the Republicans hell and, believe it or not, is favorable to your brother." The latest Gallup poll reported his approval rating at only 36%. Republicans were overjoyed, Democrats and the liberal press increasingly downcast. "Must it be Truman?" asked the nation. "Truman should quit," said the front cover of the New Republic. Harry Truman has none of the qualities demanded by the presidency. He was colorless, a little man, with a known difficulty in understanding the printed word. In the New York Times, Arthur Kroc wrote grimly, "When he, Truman, vetoed what he called the rich man's tax bill, which Congress had substituted for his own poor man's bill, numerous Democrats in Congress jumped on the bandwagon to override the veto. The Democratic Party is imperiling the president's effectiveness as no major party in this country has done since the Republican radicals impeached Andrew Johnson. A president whose defeat at the next poll is generally prophesied faces difficulties in performing his office that conceivably bring disaster. At this writing, the president's influence is weaker than any president's has been in modern history." Early in May, in advance of what was to be a crucial White House strategy conference on Palestine, Truman asked Clark Clifford to prepare the case for immediate recognition of the new Jewish state, which as yet had no name. He was to prepare himself, Truman told Clifford, as though presenting a case before the Supreme Court. "You will be addressing all of us present, of course," Truman said, "but the person I really want you to convince is Marshall." Truman, as he told Clifford, was inclined to think that Marshall was opposed to such recognition. But this had nothing to do with Truman's regard for the general, nor was there the least question about Marshall's own feelings. "I want you to know," wrote Marshall in a personal birthday greeting to the President on May 8th, "that I am keenly aware of the remarkable loyalty you have given me. In return, I can only promise you to do my best and assure you of my complete loyalty and trust in you." At a private birthday party for the President, Marshall had been still more emphatic, expressing his regard for the President in words no one present would forget. Indeed, it was one of the greatest tributes ever paid to Harry Truman. The party at the nearby F Street Club was given by Attorney General Tom Clark for some 40 guests, including the President and Mrs. Truman, and marked one of the rare times that Marshall and his wife accepted an invitation to dine out in Washington. Clark and John Snyder each rose after dinner to offer toasts. Then, unexpectedly, Marshall stood up, pushed his chair out of the way, and leaning forward with his hands on the table, began to speak, his expression very serious. Marshall, as everyone present was well aware, never complimented the people with whom he worked. It was not his way. "The full stature of this man," he said, his eyes on Truman, "will only be proven by history. But I want to say here and now that there has never been a decision made under this man's administration affecting policies beyond our shores that has not been in the best interest of this country. It is not the courage of these decisions that will live, but the integrity of the man." Truman, his face flushed, rose slowly to respond, but was unable to speak. The silence in the room was stunning. He stood with his arms half outstretched, trying to compose himself. Finally, he could only gesture to Marshall and say, "He won the war." But he spoke with such simplicity and feeling that many guests were crying. The meeting in the President's office on the afternoon of May 12th began at 4 o'clock, just 2 days and 2 hours before the British mandate in Palestine was to expire. Present were Marshall, Robert Lovett, and 2 of their State Department aides, Robert McClintock and Fraser Wilkins, Clifford, Niles, and Matt Connolly. Saying little, they took seats around Truman's desk, Marshall and Lovett on the President's left, with McClintock and Fraser just behind, Clifford sitting directly in front of the President, with Niles and Connolly to his left. Truman made a few preliminary remarks in which he said nothing about recognition of Palestine, then turned to Marshall, who asked Lovett to present the case for trusteeship. Lovett spoke at some length, during which Marshall intervened briefly to report that during a recent conversation with Moshe Shertok of the Jewish Agency, he, Marshall, had warned that militarily the Jews were embarked on a very risky venture in Palestine, and should the tide turn against them, there was nothing to guarantee help from the United States. Truman then called on Clifford, who for the first time mentioned recognition, proposing that the United States make the move quickly before the Soviet Union did. The United States should not even wait until the new Jewish state was declared, but announce American recognition the very next day, May 13th. As I talked, remembered Clifford, I noticed the thunderclouds gathering, Marshall's face getting redder and redder. "This is just straight politics," Marshall said. "I don't even understand why Clifford is here. This is not a political meeting." "General," Truman answered softly, "he is here because I asked him to be here." Clifford continued with his statement, speaking for perhaps 15 minutes. He was calm, orderly, and unhurried, his rich voice, as always, beautifully modulated, one clear, perfectly structured sentence flowing smoothly, flawlessly after another. "I had really prepared," he would say, remembering the moment a lifetime later. But Clifford was also 26 years younger than Marshall, and new to the experience of great power and large world decisions. Marshall's prestige was a palpable presence in the room and made especially memorable, especially intimidating, by his anger. He sat glaring at Clifford the entire time. Possibly it was Clifford's manner that upset Marshall, who was deeply worried about the world. Recognition of the new Jewish state, Clifford said, would be wholly consistent with what had been the President's policy from the beginning. It would be an act of humanity, everything this country should represent. The murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazis had been the worst atrocity of all time. Every thoughtful human being must feel some responsibility for the survivors who, unlike others in Europe, had no place to go. He explained the Balfour Declaration. He cited lines from Deuteronomy verifying the Jewish claim to a Palestine homeland. "Behold, I have set the land before you. Go in and possess the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give unto them and to their seed after them." There was no real alternative to the partition of Palestine, he said, or to recognition by the United States, since no postponement of the kind imagined by the State Department would ever be tolerated by the Jews. A separate Jewish state was inevitable. It would come to pass in a matter of days. No matter what the State Department or anybody thinks, we are faced with the actual fact that there is to be a Jewish state. To think otherwise was unrealistic. Lovett spoke again. To recognize a Jewish state prematurely, before its boundaries were even known or government established, would be buying a pig in a poke. He produced a file of intelligence reports indicating that numbers of Jewish immigrants to Palestine were communists or Soviet agents. The entire matter should remain a UN problem, Lovett argued. The United Nations was struggling to determine the future government in Palestine, and this at the specific urging of the United States. Any premature, ill-advised recognition of the new state would be disastrous to American prestige in the United Nations and appear only as a very transparent bid for Jewish votes in November. On this note, Marshall broke in, speaking gravely and with all the weight of his reputation, his anger just barely in control. Clifford's suggestions were wrong, Marshall said. Domestic political considerations must not determine foreign policy. At stake was the great office of the President. Indeed, said Marshall, looking directly at Truman, if the President were to follow Clifford's advice, and if in the elections in November he, Marshall, were to vote, he would vote against the President. It was an extraordinary rebuke for Truman, the sharpest rebuke ever for him, Clifford felt certain, coming as it did from Marshall, the great one of the age, whose presence in his administration gave Truman such pride and feeling of confidence. That brought the meeting to a grinding halt. There was really a state of shock. The President, I think, was struck dumb by it, Clifford would say, trying years later to evoke the feeling in the room. There was this awful, total silence. Yet Truman showed no sign of emotion. His expression, serious from the start, changed not at all. He only raised his hand and said he was fully aware of the difficulties and dangers involved, as well as the political risks which he himself would run. He was inclined to agree with General Marshall, but thought it best they all sleep on the matter. Marshall and his retinue departed, Marshall refusing even to look at Clifford, who, seething within, began gathering up his papers. It was Marshall's righteous goddamn Baptist tone that was so infuriating, he would later tell Jonathan Daniels. Marshall didn't know his ass from a hole in the ground. The president, Clifford could only conclude, had agreed with Marshall in order not to embarrass the general in front of the others. "That was rough as a cob," Truman said to Clifford, once everyone was gone. Truman told him not to feel badly. As a trial lawyer, Clifford said he had lost cases before. "Let's not agree that it's lost yet," Truman said. Would the United States recognize the new Palestine state? Reporters asked the next day. He would cross that bridge when he came to it, Truman replied. But by then the bridge was already underfoot. Lovett had telephoned Clifford the evening before, less than an hour after the meeting broke up, to say he and Clifford must talk as soon as possible. Clifford had gone to Lovett's home in Kalorama, where over drinks they agreed something had to be done or there could be a serious breach between the president and the secretary. Conceivably, Marshall might resign, which, as Clifford knew, would be the heaviest possible blow to Truman's standing with the country and undoubtedly destroy whatever small chance he had of being re-elected. Marshall was the greatest asset he had, Clifford would recall. He couldn't afford to lose him. It was painfully ironic. Marshall, who insisted there be no political considerations, Marshall, who was so above politics, had himself become the largest of political considerations. Lovett asked Clifford to think about it, but when Lovett called Clifford the next morning, Clifford told him there was nothing he could do. Lovett would have to persuade Marshall he was wrong. Truman's reaction when Clifford reported all this was that Marshall, in Truman's words, needed a little more time. That was on Thursday, the 13th. On Friday, May 14th, the day the new Jewish state was to be declared at midnight in Jerusalem, 6 p.m. Washington time, Clifford and Lovett met for lunch in the quiet of the F Street Club and worked out the wording of a statement to be released by the president. Lovett now urged only that there be no indecent haste in recognizing the new Jewish state so that the American delegation at the United Nations could have ample warning. Clifford, however, could not promise that. Sometime that afternoon, Marshall called the president to say that while he could not support the position the president wished to take, he would not oppose it publicly. "That," said Truman to Clifford, "is all we need." Clifford put through a hurried call to Elihu Epstein, an official at the Jewish Agency in Washington, to tell him that recognition would occur that day and to get the necessary papers ready and over to the White House at once. When Epstein asked what was needed, Clifford had to say he didn't exactly know. "This is very unusual," Clifford said, "a new country asking for recognition. It doesn't happen every day." Clifford called the State Department, then reported back to Epstein. When the papers finally arrived, the name of the new country had been left blank, to be filled in later, because it was still unknown. The new Jewish state, the first Jewish state in nearly 2,000 years, was declared on schedule at midnight in Jerusalem, 6 p.m. in Washington. 11 minutes later at the White House, Charlie Ross announced de facto recognition by the United States of Israel, as it was to be called. The American delegation at the United Nations was flabbergasted. Some American delegates actually broke into laughter, thinking the announcement must be somebody's idea of a joke. Ambassador Austin, the only one of the delegation who had been notified in advance, and only at the last moment, was so upset he went home without telling any of the others. At the State Department, meantime, Marshall had dispatched his head of UN Affairs, Dean Rusk, by plane to New York to keep the whole delegation from resigning. There was dancing in the streets in Brooklyn and the Bronx, a huge Salute to Israel rally at the Polo Grounds. In synagogues across the country, Thanksgiving services were held. At 2210 Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, headquarters of the Jewish Agency, a new flag was unfurled, pale blue and white, with the Star of David in the center. In Kansas City, Eddie Jacobson packed his bags and left immediately by plane for New York to see Chaim Weizmann, who was to be the new president of Israel. 3 days later, on May 17th, Jacobson presented himself at the White House as Israel's temporary unofficial ambassador. It would be pointed out as time went on that the United States had granted only de facto recognition of the new Jewish state, whereas the Soviet Union followed with a more formal de jure recognition. That Truman in succeeding months, as Israel was under attack by Arab armies, refused to lift an American embargo on arms shipments to Israel, and that in the United Nations, through that summer and fall, the United States strongly supported a policy of mediation and compromise that the Israelis opposed. But such observations failed to diminish the larger symbolic force and importance of what Truman had done. It was the President of the United States of America who had granted the world's first recognition of the new Jewish nation. And while experienced observers, including most of his own experts on foreign affairs, considered much of his performance a sorry spectacle of mismanagement, a comic opera performance, Time magazine said, there was immense approval in the country. An editorial in the Washington Star expressed well what most Americans felt. There is a great deal to be said against the past gyrations and topsy-turvy handling of American policy regarding Palestine, but that aspect of the situation is completely overshadowed at the moment by the swift and dramatic decision of the United States to take the lead among all nations in recognizing the new Jewish state of Israel. It is a wise decision and a heartening one. As the popular radio commentator and world traveler Lowell Thomas said in his broadcast that evening, Americans in every part of the country would be turning to the Bible for some historical background for this day of history. Truman had no regrets. He had achieved what he intended and had, besides, established a point about who, after all, was in charge of American policy. The difficulty with many career officials in government, he would later write, is that they regard themselves as the men who really make policy and run the government. They look upon the elected officials as just temporary occupants. Every president in our history has been faced with this problem, how to prevent career men from circumventing presidential policy. Some presidents have handled this situation by setting up what amounted to a little State Department of their own. President Roosevelt did this and carried on direct communications with Churchill and Stalin. I did not feel that I wanted to follow this method because the State Department is set up for the policy of handling foreign policy operations, and the State Department ought to take care of them. But I wanted to make it plain that the President of the United States, and not a second or third echelon in the State Department, is responsible for making policy. He felt great satisfaction in what he had been able to do for the Jewish people and was deeply moved by their expressions of gratitude, then and for years to come. When the chief rabbi of Israel, Isaac Halevi Herzog, called at the White House, he told Truman, "God put you in your mother's womb so you would be the instrument to bring the rebirth of Israel after 2,000 years. I thought he was overdoing things, remembered David Niles, but when I looked over at the president, tears were running down his cheeks. Loy Henderson was removed from his job. Truman had him reassigned far from Washington and the concerns of American policy in the Middle East. He was made ambassador to India. Interestingly, Henderson would also remain a staunch admirer of Truman, considering him one of the great American presidents. In my opinion, Henderson later said, the morale and effectiveness of the State Department were never higher than during the period that Truman was president. The morale of the department is usually higher when the president is a man who is not afraid to make difficult decisions and who is prepared to accept the responsibilities that flow from such decisions. General Marshall continued in his duties as before. When some of Marshall's friends urged him to resign, Marshall allegedly replied that one did not resign because a president who had the constitutional right to make a decision made one. However, Marshall would not speak to Clark Clifford ever again. Asked long afterward what he had thought to say to Marshall to get him to agree at the last moment to American recognition of Israel, Robert Lovett said, "I told him that it was the president's choice." 3. The year of the birth of Israel, the year of the Republican tax cut and the Truman balcony, would be remembered also as the year green, chlorophyll, chewing gum became a fad, the year of a new word game called Scrabble, of tail fins on Cadillacs, and an unimaginably daring new bathing suit called the bikini, after the island where the atomic bomb tests were carried out the summer before. The economy was booming, profits were up, farmers were prospering. American prosperity overall was greater than at any time in the nation's history. The net working capital of American corporations hit a new high of nearly $64 billion. For the steel, oil, and automobile industries, it was a banner year. Unemployment was below 4%. Nearly everyone who wanted a job had one, and though inflation continued, people were earning more actual buying power than ever before, and all this following the record year past, 1947, which, reported Fortune magazine, had been the greatest productive record in the peacetime history of this or any other nation. In London, the same summer of the 1948 National Political Conventions, American athletes Bob Mathias, Harrison Dillard, Melvin Patton swept the field in the first Olympic Games since 1936 in Berlin, winning 38 medals. It was a time of extraordinary technical and scientific achievement. A 200-inch telescope, the world's largest, was unveiled at Mount Palomar, California. Test pilot Chuck Yeager, flying a revolutionary rocket plane, the Bell X-1, broke the sound barrier. The transistor was developed, a new antibiotic, aureomycin, and cortisone to treat rheumatoid arthritis. A new kind of fuel, liquid hydrogen, promised, its inventor claimed, to send men to the moon. For evening entertainment, the country was tuning into such radio favorites as Duffy's Tavern and The Jack Benny Show. Radio dominated for news and entertainment. But approximately one family out of every 8 now owned a television machine, as Truman called it, and 1948 would be remembered as the premier year for the Camel Newsreel Theater with John Cameron Swayze, the first nightly television news program. Also, for the first time ever, there would be television broadcasts of the political conventions, these to be held in the same city, Philadelphia, in order to make such coverage easier. It was the year, too, of Christina's World, a haunting portrait by Andrew Wyeth of a crippled woman and a forsaken house on a bleak New England hill, a world bearing no relation to that of Green Gum and Supersonic Flight, that would become one of the most popular paintings ever done by an American. The music being sung and danced to in 1948 included such hit songs as Enjoy Yourself, It's Later Than You Think, It's a Most Unusual Day, and a new rendition by Pee Wee Hunt of the old Kansas City favorite 12th Street Rag. Cole Porter's Kiss Me Kate was on Broadway, and several of the new motion pictures were some of the finest ever made. The Treasure of Sierra Madre, The Red Shoes, Laurence Olivier's Hamlet. Among the best-selling books were Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead, Robert E. Sherwood's Roosevelt and Hopkins, Eisenhower's account of the war, Crusade in Europe, and Sexual Behavior in the Human Male by Alfred Kinsey, an Indiana University professor whose statistical revelations concerning male promiscuity in post-war American life caused a sensation. In January, Mahatma Gandhi had been murdered while walking through a garden in New Delhi. In March, Czechoslovakian Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk, whose father founded Czechoslovakia as a free democracy, either jumped or was pushed to his death from a third-floor window in Prague, news that stirred grief and anger as almost nothing else had done since the end of the war. But let the world not misunderstand what he said with that leap, wrote Dorothy Thompson. He said, "He who collaborates with communism chooses slavery, treason, dishonor, or suicide." In June would come a crisis in Berlin. In July, one of Truman's favorite Americans, General John J. Pershing, died at age 87, and his body lay in state under the Capitol dome. Truman rode to the Capitol without police escort to pay his respects, as he said, "In my role as a field artillery captain in World War I." As time would tell, the politics of 1948 would also introduce a number of new words and expressions into common American usage: whistle-stop, Dixiecrat, and red herring. According to scientific polls, given much attention in the press, 94% of the American people believed in God. According also to the polls, Harry Truman stood no chance of remaining president. Obviously, the Republican star is approaching its zenith, reported Life, the country's most popular magazine. Indeed, for all the change and tumult of the times, among the few accepted certainties was that it would be a Republican year, a dull campaign, and a debacle for Truman and the Democrats, worse even than 1946. Two experiences greatly influenced Truman's outlook through what remained of that spring and on into the summer and fall, giving him both courage and seemingly irrepressible confidence no matter how bleak the forecasts, and they grew steadily bleaker, or how many people deserted him, and there were to be many. The first had happened 8 years before. Nothing, no struggle, no road traveled could ever again be so difficult or look so hopeless, he felt, as had his chances in the Senate primary of 1940, the summer he ran against Lloyd C. Stark. It was a segment of Truman's past that many political commentators and forecasters might well have studied closely in 1948. Courage, the saying goes, is having done it before. And in 1948 Truman knew he had done it before, Against the odds, without money, without newspaper support, without the blessing of Franklin Roosevelt or any serious speculation by those supposedly in the know that he might actually wind up the winner. The persistent talk of his coming defeat in November, the tone of smug certainty in so much that was written and said, all had a very familiar ring to him. Of greatest importance also was the more immediate experience of a much-publicized, non-political tour made by rail cross-country in June, exactly as recommended in the Roe Report. For while the 2-week expedition was not without its blunders and embarrassments and seemed at times to have been a mistake, Truman found it exhilarating in a way nothing else could have been, and he returned to Washington looking and feeling as vigorous and sure of himself as at any time in his political life. But courage and confidence, however important, would have been hardly enough without such other imponderable attributes as genuine sympathy for human feelings, humor, common sense, physical vitality, truly exceptional physical vitality for a man in his middle 60s, pride, determination, and a fundamental unshakable Jacksonian faith in democracy, which to his mind mattered above all. Harry Truman trusted the American people. It would be said often, it sounded corny, and it was true. He loved the politicians' work of getting out among the people, loved seeing the country, loved the crowds. When local politicians came aboard the train to shake his hand, at one stop after another on this and later trips, and Truman took time for each of them, he was never just going through the motions. He genuinely liked such people, enjoyed seeing them. As president, he felt more than ever a need to see and make contact with what he called the everyday American, and he always felt better for it. On a recent evening in Washington, on one of his walks, he had decided to take a look at the mechanism that raised and lowered the middle span of the Memorial Bridge over the Potomac. Descending some iron steps, he came upon the bridge tender eating his evening supper out of a tin bucket. Showing no surprise that the President of the United States had climbed down the catwalk and suddenly appeared before him, the man said, "You know, Mr. President, I was just thinking about you." It was a greeting Truman adored and never forgot. In the primary summer of 1940 in Missouri, he had worked his way through small-town crowds pumping hands and saying, "I just wanted to come down and show you that I don't have horns and a tail just because I'm from Jackson County." Now, across the West, the refrain, somewhat modified, was heard again. "I'm coming out here so you can have a look at me and hear what I have to say and then make up your mind as to whether you believe some of the things that have been said about your president." His 16-car presidential special departed from Union Station the night of June 3rd, Truman traveling again in his special armor-plated car, the Ferdinand Magellan, and accompanied by about 20 of the White House staff, including Secret Service agents, and 59 reporters and photographers, which made it a record press party. The excuse for this non-political tour was an invitation to receive an honorary degree and deliver a commencement address at the University of California at Berkeley, but no one took the non-political claim seriously, least of all Truman, who began with his first brief stop at noon the next day, June 4th, at Crestline, Ohio. "On this non-partisan, bipartisan trip that we are taking here," he said to the obvious enjoyment of the crowd, "I understand there are a whole lot of Democrats present." The principal reason for declaring it an official presidential trip was that the Democratic Committee had no money. The cost was thus charged to the President's annual travel fund, to the outrage of leading Republicans and much of the press. What surprised everyone on board and pleased Truman exceedingly was the size of the crowds that turned out. 1,000 people at Little Crestline, 100,000 at Chicago, where he rode to the Palmer House in an open car. At Omaha, an embarrassing foul-up caused by his old friend Eddie McKim produced much adverse publicity. Fewer than 2,000 people attended a major speech. Sitting down front in the huge Ak-Sar-Ben, Nebraska spelled backward, auditorium, leaving 8,000 freshly polished empty seats stretching behind. McKim, in charge of arrangements, had neglected to publicize the fact that the speech was open to the public, and not just to Truman's old war outfit, the 35th Division, which was holding its reunion in Omaha. It was a stupid blunder. Photographs of the nearly vacant hall appeared all over the country as a show not only of Truman's pathetically low popularity, but of obvious political ineptitude. Yet Truman did not seem to mind. He went on stage as if speaking to a packed house, nor did he blame or criticize McKim. "I don't give a damn whether there's nobody there but you and me," McKim would always remember him saying. "I am making a speech on the radio to the farmers. They won't be there. They'll be home listening to that radio. They're the ones I'm going to talk to." Far more important to Truman, a better measure than the rows of empty chairs that night, was the welcome he had received in the streets of Omaha earlier the same day, when marching with the 35th Division. Wearing a light tan double-breasted gabardine suit and his favorite two-tone summer shoes, he stepped along at the head of his own Battery D, doffing a Western-style hat right and left. He looked as happy as a man could be, and the enormous crowd responded wholeheartedly. In Omaha, a Republican town. As Edward T. Folliard reported in the Washington Post, they lined the streets in this Republican stronghold, 160,000 of them, and gave President Truman a welcome reminiscent of his honeymoon days in the White House 3 years ago. Frank Spina, Truman's old barber, marched beside him, carrying the original Battery D Guidon. Behind came Eddie Jacobson, Monsignor Tiernan, Eddie McKim, and Jim Pendergast. The onlookers were thrilled and charmed. Mr. Truman, sensing their friendliness, never looked more pleased, said the Omaha Morning World Herald. President Truman was at his best Saturday morning. He marched jauntily, shoulders back. He smiled and waved his hat. Those watching the parade, astonished to see the president walking on the streets of Omaha, laughed and cheered. In April, in a conversation in his office with Arthur Kroc in answer to Kroc's question whether he detected any change in his own makeup since becoming president, Truman had said he could think of nothing except a growing sense of being walled in. Now away from Washington, back among his own kind of people, people who would naturally laugh and cheer to see him walking their streets, he felt both free from the walls and much more himself. "The president, you know, is virtually in jail," he told the crowd by the tracks at his first stop at Crestline. "He goes from his study to his office, and from his office to his study, and he has to have guards there all the time. But when you go out and see people and find out what people are thinking about, you can do a better job." Now, again and again, he let his audiences know how much being with them was doing for him, how much it meant to him to see them, how buoyed up he felt by their numbers. "It almost overwhelms me to see all the people in western Nebraska in this town today," he said at Little Sydney at the western end of the state, and he was certainly happy to see this enthusiastic crowd at Laramie, Wyoming. "My goodness," he exclaimed, looking over the turnout at Dillon, Montana. At Butte, a cheering throng lined the sidewalks several deep beside a 4-mile parade route. When his train pulled into Missoula late at night and a crowd waited, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, he appeared in his pajamas and bathrobe. "I'm sorry I'd gone to bed," he said, "but I thought you would like to see what I look like even if I didn't have on any clothes." He was folksy. He just wanted to say howdy, and often corny. He was on his way down to Berkeley to get me a degree, and the crowds grew steadily bigger. "They told me at a little town in Idaho at 5:15 a.m. the whole town was out," he wrote to Mary Jane. "I wasn't up. At Pocatello, Idaho, at 7:15 there were 2,000 people, and at Ketchum, the P.O. for this place, everybody in the county was there." There was another widely reported gaffe at Cary, a little town in southern Idaho. Dedicating the new Willicoats Airport, Truman began to praise the brave boy who had died for his country, only to be informed by a tearful Mrs. Coates that our Willa was a girl and that she had died in a civilian plane crash. Charlie Ross and Clark Clifford had been urging Truman to speak extemporaneously as much as possible, certain that with practice he could become as effective in front of a crowd as they had seen him be so often with small groups in his office. If only the public could know the Harry Truman he knew, Ross often said. In April, Truman had spoken off the cuff to the American Society of Newspaper Editors, in May to a rally of young Democrats in Washington, and both times with notable success. The press had commented favorably on the new Truman. But at times now, things he said made his staff cringe. "I have been in politics a long time, and it makes no difference what they say about you if it isn't so," he declared unexpectedly at Pocatello. "If they can prove it on you, you're in a bad fix indeed. They've never been able to prove it on me." Reporters on board began singing a many-versed song that included the refrain, "They can't prove nothing, they ain't got a thing on me, I'm going down to Berkeley for to get me a degree." Editorials in the East deplored the carnival air of the trip. The president, said the Washington Evening Star, was making a spectacle of himself. At Eugene, Oregon, recalling his meeting with Stalin at Potsdam, Truman suddenly confided to the crowd gathered about the rear platform of his car, "I like old Joe. He's a decent fellow." The remark sent reporters scrambling and caused an immediate sensation. From the State Department, Robert Lovett put through an urgent call to Clifford, who tactfully advised the president not to repeat the remark ever again. And Truman never did. "Well, I guess I goofed," he said as he rolled on in good spirits. Crossing into Washington, he made stops at Spokane, Ephrata, Wenatchee, Skykomish, Everett, Bremerton, Seattle, Tacoma, and Olympia. At Spokane, he judged there were about 2 acres of people. At Seattle, more than 100,000 people turned out, the largest crowds seen in Seattle in 30 years. Not even Franklin Roosevelt had been given such a reception. By now, a decided pattern had begun to emerge in the speeches, a free-swinging style with Congress the main target. "You know, this Congress is interested in the welfare of the better classes. They are not interested in the welfare of the common everyday man," he said at Bremerton. "Pour it on, Harry," someone shouted. I'm going to," Truman responded happily. "Educate yourselves," he told his audience at Olympia. "You don't want to do like you did in 1946. 2/3 of you stayed at home in 1946, and look what a Congress we got. That is your fault. That is your fault." A remark to a reporter that the 80th Congress was the worst in history produced immediate howls of outrage from Republicans in Washington. Harry Truman said House Majority Leader Charles Halleck was the worst president in history, while Representative Cliff Clevenger of Ohio called him a nasty little gammon and a Missouri jackass. Speaking in Philadelphia, Senator Taft deplored the spectacle of an American president blackguarding Congress at whistle stops across the country. And Democratic Party Chairman Howard McGrath and his publicity director, Jack Redding, immediately saw an opportunity too good to miss. Telegrams went out to the mayors of 35 western towns and cities on Truman's route to ask if they agreed with Senator Taft's description of their community as a whistle stop. "Must have the wrong city," responded the mayor of Eugene, Oregon. "Grand Isle was never a whistle stop," came a reply from Nebraska. In his commencement address at Berkeley, which was carried on a nationwide radio broadcast, Truman turned to foreign affairs and delivered one of the finest, most thoughtful speeches of his presidency. The setting was the University of California's huge sun-drenched football stadium, with fully 55,000 people present, twice the usual attendance at such ceremonies. "The world," said Truman, "was in a twilight time between a war so dearly won and a peace that still eludes our grasp. The chief cause of unrest was the Soviet Union. The great divide was not between the United States and the Soviet Union, but between the Soviet Union and all the free nations of the world. The refusal of the Soviet Union to work with its wartime allies for world recovery and world peace was the most bitter disappointment of our time. Different economic systems could live side by side and in peace," he said, "but only providing one side was not bent on destroying the other by force. Our policy will continue to be a policy of recovery, reconstruction, prosperity, and peace with freedom and justice. In its furtherance, we gladly join with all those of like purpose. The only expansion we are interested in is the expansion of human freedom and the wider enjoyment of the good things of the earth in all countries. The only prize we covet is the respect and goodwill of our fellow members of the family of nations. The only realm in which we aspire to eminence exists in the minds of men, where authority is exercised through the qualities of sincerity, compassion, and right conduct. I believe the men and women of every part of the globe intensely desire peace and freedom. I believe good people everywhere will not permit their rulers, no matter how powerful they may have made themselves, to lead them to destruction. America has faith in people. It knows that rulers rise and fall, but that the people live on." 2 days later, on June 14th, at Los Angeles, an estimated 1 million people packed both sides of his parade route, from the railroad station to the Ambassador Hotel. They clung to the roofs of buildings, jammed windows and fire escapes, and crowded 5 deep along the sidewalk, reported the Los Angeles Times. It was the first visit to the city by a president in 13 years. Los Angeles, said Truman with a grin that night at the press club, was quite a whistle stop. Stepping up the attack on Congress, he called for action on price controls, housing, farm support, health insurance, and a broader base for Social Security. Only that morning he had vetoed a Republican bill that would have taken 750,000 people off Social Security. Schools were overcrowded, he said, teachers underpaid. A bill for aid to education had passed the Senate and would take only 10 minutes for the House to pass, but the House was roosting on it, he said. No action, no action. The one issue passed over in this and other speeches along the way was civil rights. Truman's advisers were divided over which would help him more, saying nothing about it for now or speaking out. Truman had decided to say nothing for the time being. When a smiling Jimmy Roosevelt turned up at the Ambassador Hotel for a private conference and stood towering over Truman as they shook hands, Truman jabbed his forefinger into Roosevelt's chest and, according to the only witness to the scene, Secret Service agent Henry Nicholson, said to him, "Your father asked me to take this job. I didn't want it, and if your father knew what you're doing to me, he would turn over in his grave. But get this straight. Whether you like it or not, I'm going to be the next president of the United States. That will be all. Good day." Turning east, the train crossed Arizona, New Mexico, and Kansas, with stops the whole way, then on into Missouri, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. The crowds continued large and friendly. "Are the special privilege boys going to run the country, or are the people going to run it?" he asked. This was the theme. The election, he was sure, would ride on it. He covered 9,505 miles through 18 states, delivered 73 speeches, and was seen by perhaps 3 million people. The train reached Union Station on a steamy Washington afternoon, Friday, June 18th. Truman, his sunburned nose peeling, his lips cracked, was, as reported, full of bounce. From the first day of the 1948 Republican National Convention, when former Congresswoman Claire Booth Luce told the cheering, amused crowd that Harry Truman was a gone goose, to the final celebration on the convention floor, there was never anything but a feeling of victory in the air. The convention opened in Philadelphia on Monday, June 21st. Of the 5 most publicized contenders for first place on the Republican ticket, Dewey, Taft, Vandenberg, Stassen, and Martin, Dewey, the favorite of the party's Eastern liberal wing, showed almost overriding strength from the start and won on the third ballot after Stassen refused to release his delegates to Taft. For his running mate, Dewey chose Governor Earl Warren of California, making it a dreamboat of a ticket. 2 popular, youthful, progressive governors of the 2 largest, wealthiest states in the Union. If Dewey seemed overly cool and self-assured in manner, Warren had more than compensating warmth. Nor had anyone forgotten how close Dewey had come the last time to defeating the champion, Franklin Roosevelt. Time and Newsweek agreed that only a miracle or a series of unimaginable political blunders could save Harry Truman from overwhelming defeat. Truman thought the Republicans had made a mistake. They would have been better off with Taft, he said privately. Taft was an honorable man who deserved the nomination and would have made a tougher opponent than Dewey. In his acceptance speech, Dewey talked of national unity. "Our people yearn to higher ground, to find common purpose in the finer things which unite us." Truman, Part 2, by David McCullough. Continued, Cassette 4, Side 1. Truman had little time to dwell on the Republicans and their convention. On the day Dewey was chosen, Thursday, June 24, 1948, the Russians clamped a blockade on all rail, highway, and water traffic in and out of Berlin. The situation was extremely dangerous. Clearly, Stalin was attempting to force the Western Allies to withdraw from the city. Except by air, the Allied sectors were entirely cut off. Nothing could come in or out. 2.5 million people faced starvation. As it was, stocks of food would last no more than a month. Coal supplies would be gone in 6 weeks. Truman faced the issue with notable caution and firmness. It was suggested that the Allies force their way into Berlin by land with an armored convoy. It was suggested that the United States retaliate by closing its ports and the Panama Canal to Russian ships. Truman rejected such ideas. When, at a meeting in his office with Forrestal Lovett and Secretary of the Army Royal, the question was asked whether American forces would remain in Berlin, Truman said there was no need for discussion on that. "We stay in Berlin, period." Royal asked skeptically if the consequences had been thought through. "We will have to deal with the situation as it develops," Truman said. "We are in Berlin by the terms of the agreement, and the Russians have no right to get us out by either direct or indirect pressure." Lovett cabled the American ambassador in London that night, "We stay in Berlin." General Clay, the American commander in Berlin, had already begun shipping supplies by air on a very limited scale, a step considered little more than a palliative. On Monday, June 28th, Truman ordered a full-scale airlift. The same day he sent 2 squadrons of B-29s to Germany, the giant planes known to the world as the kind that dropped the atomic bombs on Japan. But in fact these had not been modified to carry atomic bombs, a detail the Russians were not to know. That the Berlin airlift was about to become one of the most brilliant American achievements of the post-war era and one of Truman's proudest decisions, strongly affecting the morale of Western, non-communist Europe and the whole course of the Cold War, as well as Truman's own drive for re-election, was by no means apparent to anyone at this point. No one had any idea how things would turn out in Berlin, and Truman was no exception. General Bradley, who had replaced Eisenhower as chief of staff, thought the president was being far too vague when, as Bradley later wrote, "We were nose to nose with massive Soviet military power." It hardly seemed realistic to expect a major city to be supplied entirely by air for any but a very limited time. In making his decision, for all the political heat and turmoil of the moment, Truman had consulted none of the White House staff or any of his political advisers. Indeed, throughout the blockade, as George Elsey would recall, the White House staff had no direct role whatever in any decisions or in the execution of any of the carrying out of the airlift. There was no talk of how the president's handling of the crisis would make him look, or what political advantage was to be gained, and neither did Truman try to bolster the spirits of those around him by claiming the airlift would work. He simply emphasized his intention to stay in Berlin, and left no doubt that he meant exactly what he said. Summer had arrived in Washington, and that same evening, Monday, June 28th, the President and the First Lady took their dinner on the south porch of the White House, Truman seated so he could enjoy the view. The scrap of paper on which he recorded the scene would later be found among his papers. A ball game or two goes on in the park south of the lawn, evidently a lot of competition from the cheers and calls of the coaches. A robin hops around looking for worms, finds one, and pulls with all his might to unearth him. A mockingbird imitates robin, jays, redbirds, crows, hawks, but has no individual note of his own. A lot of people like that. Planes take off and land at National Airport south of the Jefferson Memorial. It is a lovely evening. In imagination, he pictured the old Chesapeake and Ohio Canal crossing the grounds of the Washington Monument, as it had long ago, barges anchored somewhere west of the monument. "I can see old J.Q. Adams going swimming in it and getting his clothes stolen by an angry woman who wanted a job," he wrote. "Then I wake up, go upstairs, and go to work." As Churchill had observed at Potsdam, Truman was a man of immense determination. "Stubborn as a mule," others often commented. And in nothing that Truman or anyone else wrote or said as 1948 unfolded is there any indication that once having made up his mind to run for re-election, he was ever tempted to withdraw, or, like the mockingbird, to sing a song not his own. "I am not a quitter," he would say, and that was all there was to it. Yet game as he may have been, as restored in spirit as he may have felt after his swing west, there was by all signs no cause for hope among Democrats. On the eve of the Democratic National Convention, his prospects could not have appeared much more grim. It was not just that he faced a strong, heavily financed, supremely confident Republican opponent, or the threat of the Wallace movement cutting away at his support among liberals. The whole Democratic Party, the famous disparate Democratic coalition of labor, intellectuals, city bosses, and Southern segregationists fabricated by Franklin Roosevelt, was coming to pieces. Harold Ickes, as if to settle old scores with Truman, wrote to tell him, "You have the choice of retiring voluntarily and with dignity, or of being driven out of office by a disillusioned and indignant citizenry. Have you ever seen the ice on the pond suddenly break in every conceivable direction under the rays of a warming sun? This is what has happened to the Democratic Party under you, except that your party has not responded to bright sunshine. It has broken up spontaneously." The biggest break came now from Ickes's own liberal side of the party, the doctrinaire New Dealers. The call for Eisenhower, started by Roosevelt's sons, had swelled to a chorus, with Claude Pepper, Chester Bowles, former head of the Office of Price Administration, who was now running for governor of Connecticut, Mayor Hubert Humphrey of Minneapolis, who was running for the Senate, all favoring an Eisenhower draft at the convention. The Americans for Democratic Action, the ADA, recently formed as a non-communist liberal response to the Wallace movement, and sometimes known as the New Deal in Exile, voiced its preference for Eisenhower over Truman, and if not Eisenhower, then Justice William O. Douglas. Such professional Democrats as Jake Arvey of Chicago, Mayor William O'Dwyer of New York, and Boss Frank Hague of New Jersey also decided it was time for Eisenhower. Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers and Phil Murray of the CIO joined the Eisenhower movement, and so did Alabama Senators Hill and Sparkman and South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond, making it appear almost as though the old Roosevelt coalition were regrouping around the glamorous general, who by this time had become president of Columbia University. And all this was made more remarkable by the fact that no one knew anything of Eisenhower's politics. No one could say even whether he was a Democrat, let alone what his position on issues might be, on civil rights, Social Security, taxes, or how to keep peace with Stalin. To Truman and those loyal to him, the revolt of the old New Dealers was especially grating. It seemed, besides an act of personal betrayal, wholly unprincipled and intellectually dishonest. Truman had borne the banner of the New Deal as faithfully as any successor to Franklin Roosevelt possibly could have, was their feeling. No more progressive program had ever been put before Congress than the Truman program. That was a matter of record. Though Eisenhower had stated publicly several times that he was not a candidate and did not want the nomination, this did little to dissuade his new admirers. Over the 4th of July weekend, a week in advance of the Democratic Convention, the Eisenhower faction, led by Jimmy Roosevelt, wired each of the 1,592 delegates to choose the ablest, strongest man available as their candidate, adding that no man in these critical days can refuse the call to duty and leadership implicit in the nomination and virtual election to the presidency of the United States. Truman, concluded the veteran New York Times political reporter James C. Haggerty, could look forward to a hard and possibly losing fight for the nomination. In 6 months he had faced some of the roughest abuse and difficulties of any president in history. He had been castigated by Southern Democrats over civil rights, repudiated by a Republican Congress, ridiculed for his White House balcony and his Missouri cronies. He had faced the pressures of the Palestine issue, the increasing threat of war over Berlin, watched his popularity disintegrate in the polls, seen himself portrayed in the press as inept and pathetic. His party was broke. And now the New Dealers were abandoning him, and noisily. No president in memory, not even Herbert Hoover in his darkest days, had been treated with such open contempt by his own party. "If you can't stand the heat, you better get out of the kitchen," Truman liked to say, an old line in Missouri that he had first heard in the 1930s from another Jackson County politician named E.T. Buck Purcell. To a few former New Dealers, the whole spectacle was appalling. "I am simply aghast at the unfair way in which President Truman is being judged, if the current lynch law atmosphere can be called judging," recorded David Lilienthal in his diary. And the attitude of liberals and progressives now whooping it up for Eisenhower or Douglas is the hardest to understand or to be other than damn mad about. Truman's record, continued Lilienthal on July 5th, is that of a man who, facing problems that would have strained and perhaps even floored Roosevelt at his best, has met these problems head-on in almost every case. The way he took on the aggression of Russia, his civil rights program upon which he hasn't welched or trimmed, my God, what do these people want? If it is said that he wobbled on veterans' housing or Palestine or this or that, did FDR never wobble? Don't be funny. FDR wobbled through the Neutrality Act and arms embargo, isolation of the very worst and blindest kind. He wobbled on economic matters all the time. Did FDR ever stand up for public development of power or human rights or labor, essentially any more firmly than Truman? And who knows what Eisenhower would do on any of these issues? Bah! It is grossly unfair. They say the people want someone else, that the people aren't for him. Well, who in the hell but the Southern extremists and the perfectionist liberals together have created the impression, eagerly encouraged, of course, by the reactionaries and the Republicans, that the people don't have confidence in him? That makes me mad and rather ill. These hounders of a real man. When Matt Connolly reported the defection of Frank Hague to Truman, he merely said, "All right, let him go. I never did like him anyhow." Writing in his diary later the same day, Truman would describe Hague, Jimmy Roosevelt, Jake Arvey, and the ADA as double-crossers all, adding, "But they'll get nowhere. A double dealer never does." The Democratic leaders opposing his nomination were all acting very foolishly. He was certain Eisenhower was not a candidate, perhaps not even a Democrat. "I don't think he would be a candidate on the Democratic ticket anyway," he wrote to a friend. The influence of a sitting president as leader of his party was too great to be thwarted. Not even Theodore Roosevelt, with all his popularity, had been able to deny the Republican nomination to the incumbent Taft in 1912, he reminded his staff. Did he think he would have enough pledged delegates to win on the first ballot at Philadelphia? Truman was asked at his press conference on July 1st. "Sure," he said. But he may not have been so sanguine as professed, not according to a story later recounted by Arthur Kroc, whose source apparently was Kenneth Royal. At a bull session over drinks, among some half-dozen administration figures on the south portico of the White House one evening shortly before the convention, Truman asked what they all thought would happen were Eisenhower's name put in nomination. Claude Pepper, already in Philadelphia, had proposed that the convention draft Eisenhower as a national rather than a party candidate. Everyone but Royal assured the president he would make short shrift of any such attempt. Truman, noticing Royal's silence, asked for his view. Ike would be nominated by acclamation, Royal said, causing a furor among the others. Truman said nothing, but afterward, at the White House door, an usher told Royal the president wished to see him upstairs. He found Truman in the Oval study with John Snyder. "I wanted to tell you," Truman said, "that I agree with you." Then, according to the story, Truman asked how the presentation of Ike's name could be prevented, and Royal, assuring Truman that the general too had the same objective, agreed to see what he could do. In a telephone conference with Ike, wrote Arthur Kroc, Royal worked out the statement that Eisenhower sent to Pepper and others that put an end to the effort to present his name. On Friday, July 9th, Eisenhower again said no, his refusal this time final and complete, and no matter under what terms. On reading the Eisenhower telegram, Boss Haig reportedly crunched out his cigar, saying, "Truman, Harry Truman, oh my God." Claude Pepper, refusing to give up, declared it no time for politics as usual, and announced he would run himself. His candidacy lasted a day. Clark Clifford slipped in and out of Philadelphia to pass the word that the president had telephoned William O. Douglas, who was on vacation in Oregon's Wallowa Mountains. Douglas was Truman's choice for vice president. He would give the ticket geographical balance. He was youthful, strong on civil rights, a solid New Dealer. Douglas only wanted time to consider. Clifford was in the thick of things as usual, but more out of devotion to Truman than any high expectations. None of us, he later admitted, really felt at the time that the nomination meant very much. Our aim was just to get the president nominated, because it would have been an unconscionable reflection on him if, after 4 years, the party had turned him down and gone to somebody else. Though the Eisenhower boom had passed, it had been a measure of how intensely fearful Democrats had become of a debacle in November. It was not just that Harry Truman would fail to be re-elected, but that he would pull everyone down with him. After 16 years with the all-time winner, FDR, as their standard-bearer, they now faced the prospect of a certain loser. And if there was anyone left banking on a revival of party spirit, once everybody was gathered in Philadelphia, the illusion was quickly disabused. The newly arrived delegates who wandered through the city's empty Sabbath streets on July 10th, the day before the opening gavel, looked, it was reported, like nothing so much as mourners at a funeral. "We got the wrong rigs for this convention," a cab driver was quoted. "They should have given us hearses." Attendance was below expectations. Hotels that had been booked solid, their lobbies a continuous hubbub during the Republican convention just weeks before, were receiving cancellations. Bunting and flags left over from the Republican affair looked pathetically shop-worn. "You could cut the gloom with a corn knife," remembered Alban Barkley. The very air smelled of defeat. The crowd expected for the opening day at Convention Hall failed to materialize. The galleries were largely empty. Delegates down on the floor milled about during the speeches or shifted restlessly in their seats, fanning themselves furiously in the almost unbearable heat, for though the auditorium had been refurbished at great expense for this and the Republican convention, there was no air conditioning, and the big television lights, in combination with Philadelphia's oppressive summer weather, had made the place a steam bath. The temperature at the rostrum was 93 degrees. It was the presence and paraphernalia of television, the lights, cables, wires, microphones, amplifiers, cameras, the swarms of technicians, and the theatrics involved, that gave the event what novelty and interest it had. For many who attended, television would be the best-remembered part of the 1948 Democratic Convention. Everything possible had been done to make the political show come off, and like their Republican counterparts, one Democrat after another now submitted to pancake makeup and eyeshadow before going to the rostrum or in preparation for a candid, off-the-floor interview. Several women addressed the convention wearing brown lipstick because they were told it would look better on the black-and-white home screens. Reporters in the press gallery wore dark glasses in order to work in the fierce glare of the lights. At the White House, arrangements had been made for Truman to watch as much or as little of the proceedings as he wished. A new console-type Dumont television set with a 12-inch screen had been brought into his office and positioned against the wall to his left. So in somewhat fuzzy black-and-white images, he would follow the proceedings right from his chair, like no president ever before. When television cameras were set up in the press room for the first time on the afternoon of the 12th, for an NBC broadcast of a half-hour discussion with several White House correspondents, Truman and his staff gathered about the new set to watch. William O. Douglas had by now decided to refuse second place on the ticket for the reason, he told Truman, that he wished to remain on the Supreme Court. Truman was deeply hurt. "I stuck my neck all the way out for Douglas, and he cut the limb out from under me," he remarked to his staff. Reportedly, Douglas had told others he did not want to be number 2 man to a number 2 man. From the podium at Philadelphia that night, in a rousing keynote address, Alban Barkley brought the convention to life for the first time. The band played My Old Kentucky Home. Delegates cheered and stopped. It was a speech made for the occasion, as the old war-horse politician, an orator of the old school and a sentimental favorite Democrat who had been born in a log cabin, evoked the past glories of the New Deal and heaped unmerciful scorn on the opposition. And it was a speech, not incidentally, made for television. Truman, watching at the White House, was nearly as pleased as the crowd at Convention Hall. Dewey, in his acceptance speech, had vowed to clean the cobwebs from Washington. Barkley, with perspiration pouring from his brow and nose, declared he was not an expert on cobwebs. "But if memory does not betray me, when the Democratic Party took over the government 16 years ago, even the spiders were so weak from starvation that they could not weave a cobweb in any department of the government in Washington." For the first time, it seemed a real convention. Barkley was a hero and a favorite for second place on the ticket. There was even talk of Barkley for president. Yet Barkley had never said a word about victory in November and mentioned Truman only once in a speech lasting more than an hour. Truman, as much as he had enjoyed the performance, commented that Barkley had all the markings of a man trying for the presidency. Howard McGrath called from Philadelphia to find out if the president had seen the speech and to say it had put Barkley out in front for the nomination for vice president. If Barkley was what the convention wanted, Truman said, then Barkley was his choice too. He tried to reach Barkley by phone that night, but Barkley had gone to bed. Until now, Truman had felt he needed someone like Douglas, a strong liberal, to run with him, and preferably someone younger than he. Barkley was neither. At 71, he was 7 years older than Truman, and coming from Kentucky, he would bring no geographical balance to the ticket. The contrast with the Republican ticket could be damaging. But by phone the next morning, Truman asked Barkley why he had never told him he wanted to be vice president. "I didn't know you wanted the nomination," Truman said. "Mr. President, you do not know it yet," Barkley answered. "Well, if I'd known you wanted it, I certainly would have been agreeable," Truman said, which, though hardly a ringing confirmation, was sufficient for both to consider the decision settled, and almost immediately afterward in Philadelphia, McGrath told reporters that if the convention saw fit to nominate Senator Barkley for vice president, the president would be most happy. Barkley, who had been available as a vice presidential choice at every convention since 1928, told friends that if the nomination were to be his, he wanted it quickly. "I don't want it passed around so long it is like cold biscuit." As it was, Truman showed more distress over the Douglas refusal than enthusiasm over Barkley. To his staff, he seemed oddly, almost irresponsibly disinterested in the whole matter. He, if anyone, should have appreciated the potential importance of the decision. Yet there was no sign of thoughtful deliberation on his part. Talking about the vice presidency, wrote Eben Ayers, the president said he never did care much who was nominated with him. Excitement over Barkley was quickly eclipsed as a floor fight broke out over civil rights. A Negro alternate from St. Louis makes a minority report suggesting the unseating of the Mississippi delegation, Truman recorded as he watched the drama unfold on the tiny black-and-white screen. Vaughn is his name. He's overruled. Then Congressman Dawson of Chicago, another Negro, makes an excellent talk on civil rights. These two colored men are the only speakers to date who seem to be for me wholeheartedly. The following day, Wednesday, July 14th, the day scheduled for Truman's nomination and acceptance speech, the uproar over civil rights turned angry as a vehement ADA faction headed by Mayor Hubert Humphrey demanded a stronger civil rights plank in the party platform. The existing plank was substantially what it had been in the 1944 platform, mild and ambiguous enough to mollify the Southern delegations, and the wording had been agreed to at the White House, Truman and his advisers having decided now was no time to alienate the Southerners. Humphrey was warned he would split the party and ruin his own career if he persisted. But Humphrey and his forces held out for a plank that would emphatically endorse Truman's own civil rights program, item by item, anti-poll tax and anti-lynching legislation, fair employment laws, an end to segregation in the armed services. In bitter, heated sessions of the platform committee on the top floor of the Bellevue Stratford, Humphrey charged that the administration plank was a sellout to states' rights over human rights. When the committee approved the moderate plank, the Humphrey forces took the fight to the convention floor. "We were inherently stronger than Truman's followers had believed," remembered one of them, Paul Douglas, a candidate for the Senate in Illinois. As the majority report of the platform committee was being read before the convention and Humphrey sat near the rostrum waiting his turn to speak, Boss Ed Flynn beckoned Humphrey to show him the minority report, and having looked it over, Flynn said, "Young man, that's just what this party needs." Unlike Jake Arvey and Frank Hague, Flynn had thought the whole Eisenhower idea silly, and that those who imagined otherwise were hacks and amateurs, blind to his own favorite political maxim, never confuse wishes with facts. There was no question that Harry Truman would be nominated, Flynn had been saying, and he wanted to see Harry Truman win. Humphrey stepped to the podium, his face shining, the audience suddenly hushed. He spoke less than 10 minutes, and he made history. It was time for the Democratic Party to move forward. "There are those who say to you, we are rushing this issue of civil rights. I say we are 172 years late. The time has arrived for the Democratic Party to get out of the shadow of states' rights and walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights." As the convention roared its approval, the California and Illinois delegations marched into the aisles. Others followed, joined by a 40-piece band led by James C. Petrillo, head of the American Federation of Musicians, while here and there glum, silent Southern delegations kept their seats. At the podium, Sam Rayburn of Texas, permanent chairman of the convention, looked down disapprovingly, fearing a Southern walkout would destroy whatever slim chance Truman might have in November and devastate the party, possibly forever. Rayburn tried to stall a vote, but when it came, the Humphrey forces won a resounding victory. Told the Alabama delegation intended to lead a walkout that night on the final roll call, Rayburn ordered a voice vote instead, and the convention again thundered its approval. At the White House, angered by the turn events were taking, Truman spoke of Humphrey and his followers as crackpots, who hoped the South would bolt. But the fact was the convention that seemed so pathetically bogged down in its own gloom had now suddenly dramatically pushed through the first unequivocal civil rights plank in the party's history. And whether Truman and his people appreciated it or not, Hubert Humphrey had done more to re-elect Truman than would anyone at the convention other than Truman himself. There were television cameras at Union Station for the president's departure that evening, and there would be more cameras at the Philadelphia station when he arrived. "No privacy sure enough now," he wrote, though he remained calm and composed. He had a surprise for the convention, and he knew what the effect would be. On their home screens, those still relatively few Americans who owned television sets in 1948 saw him sitting quietly at the window of his private railroad car waiting to leave the station. The First Lady, Margaret, Charlie Ross, Clifford, Elsie, Ayers, Connolly, and Sam Rosenman were on board with him and had dinner en route while Truman kept to himself in his room going over his notes. It was by radio, approximately halfway to Philadelphia, that he heard the Alabama delegation and part of the Mississippi delegation stage their walkout. "Hard to hear," he noted. "My daughter and my staff try to keep me from listening. Think maybe I'll be upset. I won't be." At Philadelphia, where a fine rain was falling, he stepped from the train at 9:15, looking relaxed and spotless in a white linen suit. From the station he was driven directly to the convention hall, now packed to capacity, the crowd noisy and full of anticipation, and suffering intensely from the heat, suit jackets long since discarded, ties and collars undone, shirts stained dark with perspiration. The seconding speeches had begun, and as they dragged on, Truman was kept out of sight, first in McGrath's so-called office, a stifling room with no windows, then in the somewhat cooler air on an outdoor ramp near the stage entrance, overlooking an alley and the railroad tracks. He was joined by Alban Barkley, and together they sat chatting side by side, hour after hour, Truman in a straight-backed wooden chair, Barkley in a more accommodating red leather armchair that someone had borrowed from the speaker's platform. To many who had attended other national conventions over the years, this one was as bungled, as badly managed as any in memory. Newsweek called it the worst-managed, most dispirited convention in American political annals. And the idea that a president of the United States had to wait his turn as Truman did under such conditions seemed the final straw. The scene would be portrayed in some accounts as one of the extreme low points of Truman's career. However, neither Truman nor Barkley saw it that way. Barkley would remember having a very agreeable visit during which they talked about many things: politics, trivia, how to bring up daughters. To Truman, too, it was an interesting and instructive evening, as he recorded in his diary. Tom Evans, remembering the hot, horrible night, would describe Truman sitting calmly in his white suit. "And I give you my word of honor there wasn't a wrinkle in it. He was cool, collected. It didn't seem to bother him at all. To be a professional in politics required patience, often great patience, and the strength not to take things too personally, and Truman and Barclay were two veteran professional politicians. They did what you do under such circumstances, recalled George Elsey. They waited. Nearly 4 hours went by as the seconding speeches were followed by the balloting for president. At 12:42, Truman was finally nominated, receiving 948 votes, while 263 votes went to Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, the last-minute candidate of the South. Then, by acclamation, Barclay was nominated for vice president. So it was nearly 2 o'clock in the morning when Truman and Barclay at last made their entrance, striding onto the platform as the band played Hail to the Chief. Considering the time, the fatigue of the crowd, it was a scene made for failure. Any radio or television audience that Truman might have hoped for was long since asleep. To make matters a little worse, the sister of a former Pennsylvania senator suddenly released a flock of white pigeons, doves of peace, supposedly, from a floral Liberty Bell, where they had been held all night cooped up in the heat. The distraught birds careened desperately into the air every which way, smashing into the balcony, the lights, bombarding spectators, and swooping so low over the rostrum that Chairman Rayburn had to fend off several at once, to the delight of the crowd, as well as Truman and Barclay, who were laughing uproariously. Years later, Truman would describe how one pigeon had actually landed on Rayburn's bald head, a claim that Rayburn, who saw nothing funny in the situation, stoutly denied, telling an interviewer, "Harry Truman's a goddamn liar. No pigeon ever lit on my head." Barclay spoke first, and briefly. Then came Truman's turn. He advanced to the microphones, his natty white suit gleaming now in the full glare of the lights. And despite the hour, the heat, the discomfort, and weariness of his audience, he did what no one would have thought possible. Wasting no time with pleasantries or grand phrases, his head up as he spoke without a script, his voice strong, hands chopping the air, he brought the convention immediately to its feet, cheering. "Senator Barclay and I will win this election and make these Republicans like it. Don't you forget that." Not until this moment had anyone used the word win as though he meant it. The Democratic Party would win in November because the Democratic Party was the People's Party. The Republicans were the party of the privileged few, as always. For the first time since 1945, he was speaking not as a leader by accident, by inheritance, but by the choice of his party. He was neither humble, nor elegant, nor lofty. The contrast with Dewey's stilted acceptance speech from the same platform could not have been greater. In manner as well as content, he was drawing the line so there could be no mistaking one candidate for the other. Mere victory was not the purpose, Dewey had proclaimed, as if he had already been elected. "Our task," Dewey had said, "is to fill our victory with such meaning that mankind everywhere yearning for freedom will take heart and move forward." Truman declared, "Now it is time for us to get together and beat the common enemy." He was cracker-barrel plain, using words like rotten for the Republican tax bill and poppycock for the Republican platform promise to increase Social Security benefits. Life magazine called it his Lil Abner Ozark style. It was exactly in the spirit of the vehement backcountry politics he loved and where he knew he belonged, the tradition of Andrew Jackson and William Jennings Bryan, alive and full of fight. He listed the gains for farmers, for labor and the poor achieved under 16 years of Democratic leadership, and he tore into the Republican-dominated 80th Congress for holding up progress on housing, aid to education, medical care, and, yes, civil rights. "Everybody knows that I recommended to the Congress the Civil Rights Program. I did that because I believed it to be my duty under the Constitution. Some of the members of my own party disagree with me violently on this matter, but they stand up and do it openly. People can tell where they stand. But the Republicans all profess to be for these measures, but the Congress failed to act." Indeed, he said there was a long list of promises in the new Republican platform, things of great importance that the Republicans claimed they wanted, but that the Republicans who controlled Congress had prevented his administration from doing. It was then he unveiled his surprise, his bombshell, and speaking so rapidly the words seemed to run together as though all joined by hyphens. "I am therefore calling this Congress back into session July 26th. On the 26th of July, which out in Missouri we call Turnip Day, I am going to call Congress back and ask them to pass laws to halt rising prices, to meet the housing crisis, which they are saying they are for in their platform. I shall ask them to act upon aid to education, which they say they are for, civil rights legislation, which they say they are for." The cheering and stomping in the hall was so great he had to shout to be heard. "Now, my friends, if there is any reality behind the Republican platform, we ought to get some action from a short session of the 80th Congress. They can do this job in 15 days if they want to do it. They will still have time to go out and run for office." He was calling the Republicans' bluff. Let 'em make good. And the delegates were ecstatic. "He had set the convention on fire," said the New York Times. "He walked out there," remembered Clark Clifford, "and reached down within himself, found the strength and the inspiration to make that fiery speech which was necessary to put him over." Critics on the left and the right found themselves grudgingly moved by such nerve and audacity in the face of the odds and by his effect on the crowd. "They sensed," wrote Max Lerner, "that this was the most militant presidential acceptance speech in either party since Bryan. They liked the fact that he came out of his corner fighting. It was a great speech for a great occasion, and as I listened I found myself applauding." Even the New Republic bestowed the ultimate compliment. The speech was as cannily suited to the time and setting as any Franklin Roosevelt might have made. For that night at least, Harry Truman was a real leader. "You can't stay cold about a man who sticks out his chin and fights," Time reported one delegate exclaiming. Truman was likened to the brave sea captain who rallies the crew to save the sinking ship. In fact, he was exactly like the Missouri artillery captain in the Vosges Mountains in 1918, who, when his battery panicked under enemy attack, stood by his guns and with a fierce harangue got his men back in order again. The Republicans charged him with crude politics. The call for a special session of Congress was the act of a desperate man, the last hysterical gasp from an expiring administration. Of course it was politics, wrote Jonathan Daniels, and effective politics, tough and native. What it did above all, as Truman intended, was to put the focus on Congress and thus on the split between those Republicans who, like Dewey and Earl Warren, favored much that had been set in motion since the 1930s by the New Deal, and those Republicans who remained obstructionists. It made the 80th Congress the issue, put the Republicans on the defense, and left Dewey with the dubious choice of either standing up for the 80th Congress and thereby assume a share of responsibility for its failings, or remain aloof, which would seem less than courageous for a standard-bearer. As a political strategist, Truman had been devilishly astute, Speaker of the House Joe Martin later conceded. No president had called an emergency session of Congress in an election year since 1856. On the 25th of July, went an old Missouri saying, "Sow your turnips wet or dry." The Congress that met on the 26th, the 25th was a Sunday, would be known as the Turnip Congress. "Arrived in Washington at the White House at 5:30 a.m., my usual time getting up," Truman jotted on his calendar for July 15th, after the return from Philadelphia. "But go to bed at 6 and listen to the news. Sleep until 9:15, order breakfast, and go to the office at 10. I called a special session of the Congress. My, how my opposition screams. I'm going to attempt to make them meet their platform promises before the election. That is, according to the kept press and the opposition leadership, cheap politics. I wonder what expensive politics will be like." In a red brick auditorium in Birmingham, Alabama, 2 days later, a hurriedly assembled conference of states' rights Democrats, Dixiecrats as they now called themselves, waved Confederate flags and cheered Alabama's former Governor Frank M. Dixon as he denounced Truman's civil rights program as an effort to reduce us to the status of a mongrel inferior race. Then unanimously chose Governor Strom Thurmond of South Carolina to be their candidate for president, and for vice president, Governor Fielding L. Wright of Mississippi. The Dixiecrat platform called for the segregation of the races and the racial integrity of each race. Their hope was to deny both Truman and Dewey a majority, and thus throw the election into the House of Representatives. Asked why he was breaking with the Democratic Party now, when Roosevelt had made similar promises as Truman on civil rights, Strom Thurmond responded, "But Truman really means it." On July 27th, once again at the Philadelphia Convention Hall, Henry Wallace's Progressive Citizens of America, with more than 3,000 delegates, far more than at either the Republican or Democratic conventions, rallied to acclaim Wallace their candidate for the presidency, and Senator Glenn H. Taylor, the singing cowboy of Idaho, as their improbable choice for a running mate. Taylor, a Democrat, had campaigned for the Senate in 1944 singing, "Oh, give me a home by the Capitol Dome." Black delegates were present in impressive numbers. Nearly a third of the delegates were women. Youth predominated. The average progressive on hand in Philadelphia was described as 20 years younger and 30 pounds lighter than his or her Democratic or Republican counterpart. Comparably little alcohol was consumed, and there were no smoke-filled rooms this time. But there was also a noticeable absence of political experience on hand, and though neither Wallace nor Taylor, nor any but a small minority of delegates, were communists, the conspicuous presence of such celebrated pro-communists as Paul Robeson and New York Congressman Vito Marcantonio, plus the obvious dominating presence of communists throughout the whole new helter-skelter progressive organization, was to many observers and much of the country deeply disturbing. As he had from the start of his crusade, Wallace refused to repudiate his communist support. He would not repudiate any support that came to him, he said, on the basis of interest in peace. Senator Taylor stressed the distinction between pink communists and red communists, telling reporters that the pink variety wished to change the American system through evolution rather than revolution, and that they would support the progressive cause. In contrast, the red variety would be backing Dewey on the theory that revolution would inevitably follow another Hoover-style administration. The progressive platform that emerged from the convention was virtually no different from the Communist Party platform in its denunciation of the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, the new draft law, and called for the destruction of American nuclear weapons, which were still the only nuclear weapons known to exist. When a Vermont farmer named James Hayford introduced an amendment saying it was not the Progressive Party's intention to endorse the foreign policy of any other country, the idea was denounced as the reflection of pressure from outside and voted down, which Wallace knew to be a mistake but did nothing to stop. Wallace delivered his acceptance speech at Philadelphia's Shibe Park before an exuberant crowd of more than 30,000 people who had paid for their seats, a progressive innovation to meet expenses. He blamed American policy for most of the world's troubles and tensions, never once criticizing the Soviet Union. Concerning Berlin, he said there was nothing to lose by giving it up in the search for peace. We stand against the kings of privilege who own the old parties, who attempt to control our thoughts and dominate the life of man everywhere in the world. 4. In the stifling, relentless heat of summer in Washington, the Turnip Congress got reluctantly underway. Tension over Berlin increased almost by the hour, and to Truman's extreme annoyance, James Forrestal launched a campaign behind closed doors to turn custody of the atomic bomb over to the military chiefs. From testimony being given before the House Un-American Activities Committee by a woman named Elizabeth Bentley and a Time magazine editor named Whittaker Chambers, both former communists, it also appeared a major spy scandal was unfolding. Visitors to the president's office found him looking tired and preoccupied. Bess and Margaret having made their annual summer departure from Missouri, he was feeling particularly alone again. "It is hot and humid and lonely," he wrote the night after putting them on the train. "Why in hell does anybody want to be a head of state? Damned if I know." He had had no change of heart about Berlin. American forces would remain. That was his decision, he said again, meeting with Marshall and Forrestal on July 19th, and he would stand by it until all diplomatic means had been tried to reach some kind of accommodation to avoid war. "We'll stay in Berlin, come what may. I don't pass the buck, nor do I alibi out of any decision I make," he noted privately. He was convinced, as was Marshall, that the future of Western Europe was at stake in Berlin, not to say the well-being of the 2.5 million people in the city's Allied sectors. Stalin was obviously determined to force the Allies out of Berlin. "If we wished to remain there, we would have to make a show of strength," Truman later wrote. But there was always the risk that Russian reaction might lead to war. We had to face the possibility that Russia might deliberately choose to make Berlin the pretext for war. The Allies had all of 6,500 troops in Berlin, 3,000 American, 2,000 British, and 1,500 French, while the Russians had 18,000, backed by an estimated 300,000 in the east zone of Germany. With the airlift now in its fourth week, heavily laden American and British transports were roaring into Berlin hundreds of times a day and in all weather. They came in low, one after another, lumbering just over the tops of the ruined buildings, as crowds gathered in clusters to watch. German children with toy planes played airlift in the rubble as the real drama went on overhead. It had been General Clay's initial estimate that possibly 700 tons of food could be delivered to the beleaguered city by air in what would be a very big operation. Already some days the tonnage was twice that, and now, too, Almost unimaginably, coal was arriving out of the sky by the plane load. Pilots and crew were making heroic efforts. At times, planes were landing as often as every 4 minutes, British Yorks and Dakotas, American C-47s, and the newer, much larger 4-engine C-54s, which had been dispatched to Germany from Panama, Hawaii, and Alaska. Most planes averaged 3 flights a day from Frankfurt to Berlin's Gatow or Tempelhof fields, a distance of 275 miles. Ground crews worked round the clock. "We were proud of our Air Force during the war. We're prouder of it today," said the New York Times. Already 3 American crewmen had been killed when their C-47 crashed. Still, the effort was not enough. On July 15th, a record day, 1,450 tons were flown into Berlin. Yet to sustain the city, 2,000 tons of food alone were needed every day, plus 12,000 tons of fuel and supplies. In winter, the demands for fuel would be far greater. The mayor of Berlin had said it would be impossible to provide the necessary food and coal supplies by air. But every expert knows, reported a London paper, that aircraft, despite their immense psychological effect, cannot be relied upon to provision Berlin in the winter months. Allied officials in Berlin worried about the increased activity of Russian Yak fighter planes in the air corridors. Secretary of the Army Royal ordered General Clay to fly home to Washington to report to the President, which Truman thought a mistake. "My mutton-head Secretary of the Army ordered Clay home from Germany and stirred up a terrific howdy-do for no good reason," he wrote to Bess. At a National Security Council meeting on July 22nd, Clay said the people of Berlin would stand firm, even if it meant further hardships. Probably the Russians would try to stop any attempt by an armed convoy to break through at this stage, but they were not likely to interfere with air traffic unless, of course, they were determined to provoke a war. Did the Russians want war? Truman asked. Clay did not think so. No one could be sure. Truman rejected the convoy idea. When Truman inquired what problems might result from increasing the airlift, General Hoyt Vandenberg, Air Force Chief of Staff, voiced concern that American air strength elsewhere in the world would be dangerously reduced. But that was a risk Truman would take. The airlift would be vastly increased, he decided, expressing again his absolute determination to stay in Berlin. More of the big C-54 transports would be sent. Clay ordered another Berlin airfield built, and in response to his call, 30,000 Berliners went to work to clear the rubble and grade the runways. There is considerable political advantage to the administration in its battle with the Kremlin, James Rowe had written in his effort to outline a political strategy for 1948. In time of crisis, the American citizen tends to back up his president. So by such reasoning, the Berlin crisis, if kept in bounds, was made to order for Truman. Yet in nothing he said or wrote is there a sign of his playing the situation for political advantage. Rather, the grave responsibilities he bore as president at this juncture seem to have weighed more heavily on him than at any time since assuming office. He felt the campaign and its distractions, the drain it put on his time and strength, could not be coming at a worse time, as he told Churchill in a letter on July 10th. "I'm going through a terrible political trial by fire. Too bad it must happen at this time. Your country and mine are founded on the fact that the people have the right to express themselves on their leaders, no matter what the crisis. We are in the midst of grave and trying times. You can look with satisfaction upon your great contribution to the overthrow of Nazism and fascism in the world. Communism, so-called, is our next great problem. I hope we can solve it without the blood and tears the other two caused." Only the day before the National Security Council meeting about Berlin on July 21st, at the meeting arranged by Forrestal to discuss the custody of the atomic bomb, Truman had looked dreadful and, in a moment of annoyance, revealed as vividly as he ever would how much more he dwelt on the horror of the atomic bomb than most people, even those close to him, imagined, or than he wished anyone to know. The President greeted us rather solemnly. He looked worn and grim, none of the joviality that he sometimes exhibits, and we got right down to business, wrote David Lilienthal in his diary that night, when the whole scene and everything said were still fresh in his mind. It was an important session, and a kind of seriousness hung over it that wasn't relieved a bit, needless to say, by the nature of the subject and the fact that even at that moment some terrible thing might happen in Berlin. I rather think it was one of the most important meetings I have ever attended. Present besides Truman, Forrestal, and Lilienthal were the 4 other members of the Atomic Energy Commission, plus Secretary of the Army Royal, Secretary of the Air Force Stuart Symington, and Donald F. Carpenter, an executive of the Remington Arms Company who was chairman of the Military Liaison Committee of the National Military Establishment. It was Carpenter who opened the discussion by reading aloud a formal letter requesting an order from the President that would turn custody of the atomic bomb over to the Joint Chiefs, on the grounds that those who would be ultimately responsible for use of the weapon should have it in their possession, to increase familiarity with it and to unify command. Truman, who did not appreciate being read to in such fashion, cut him off, saying curtly, "I can read." He turned to Lilienthal, who said the real issue was one of broad policy, and that the bomb must not be the responsibility of anyone other than the President, because of his constitutional roles as both Commander-in-Chief and Chief Magistrate. Civilian control was essential, Lilienthal said. But then Symington spoke, delivering an incongruously light-hearted account of a visit to Los Alamos, where our fellows told him they should have the bomb just to be sure it worked, though one scientist said he did not think it should ever be used. "I don't either," Truman interjected, his face expressionless. He went on, "I don't think we ought to use this thing unless we absolutely have to. It is a terrible thing to order the use of something that—" And here, as Lilienthal recorded, Truman paused and looked down at his desk rather reflectively. "That is so terribly destructive beyond anything we have ever had. You have got to understand that this isn't a military weapon." "I shall never forget this particular expression," wrote Lilienthal. "It is used to wipe out women and children and unarmed people, and not for military uses. So we have got to treat this differently from rifles and cannon and ordinary things like that." In times past, Truman had spoken of the bomb as a military weapon like any other. In times past, he had spoken of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as military targets. Not anymore. It was an extraordinary declaration, refuting absolutely, as Lilienthal understood, any thought that Truman was insensitive to the horror of the bomb or took lightly his responsibilities as Commander-in-Chief. Yet Symington seemed not to understand Truman's point or the mood of the moment. "Our fellows need to get used to handling it," Symington repeated, referring now to the military. "They had to understand," Truman said sternly and solemnly, "that he had other considerations to weigh. This is no time to be juggling an atom bomb around." He rose from his desk. He had had more than enough. The discussion was ended. The others stood and departed. If what worried the President in part was whether he could trust these terrible forces in the hands of the military establishment, wrote Lilienthal that night, the performance these men gave certainly could not have been reassuring. 2 days later, at the close of a cabinet meeting dealing with domestic issues, Truman held Forrestal a moment longer than the others to tell him the bomb would continue in civilian custody. Privately, Truman had been expressing concern about Forrestal, who, as Truman said, seemed lately unable to take hold. "I went down the river on the yacht Friday at noon and slept around the clock," Truman wrote to Mary Jane first thing Monday morning, July 26th. "I sure enough needed it, and I'll need some more before November. It's all so futile. Dewey, Wallace, the cockeyed Southerners, and then if I win, which I'm afraid I will, I'll probably have a Russian war on my hands. 2 wars are enough for anybody, and I've had 2. I go to Congress tomorrow and read them a message requesting price control, housing, and a lot of other necessary things, and I'll in all probability get nothing, but I've got to try." On Capitol Hill, the special session of Congress opened, and later that same day, Truman sprung another surprise. Without warning, he announced executive orders to end discrimination in the armed forces and to guarantee fair employment in the civil service. His reception when he appeared before Congress the next day was noticeably cool. As a show of their resentment, some members did not even rise from their seats as he entered. He called for action on an 8-point program, including civil rights, controls on consumer credit, an excess profits tax, strengthened rent control, price controls, action on housing, farm support, aid to education, an increased minimum wage, and change in the Displaced Persons Act that discriminated against Catholics and Jews, all that he had asked for before and had been denied. From his office in Albany, Governor Dewey said nothing one way or the other, but through his campaign manager, Herbert Brownell, encouraged Republican leaders in Congress to give careful consideration to the president's program. Taft absolutely refused, saying, "No, we're not going to give that fellow anything." To Taft, as to most Republicans and much of the public, the whole affair was a cheap political ploy. The 2-week session accomplished little, as Truman had anticipated, except to make his point that a Republican Congress was the great roadblock to social progress for the country, and to show the gulf between Republican promises and Republican performance. "They sure are in a stew and mad as wet hens," he told Bess. If I can make them matter, maybe they'll do the job the old gods used to put on the Greeks and Romans." On August 4th on Capitol Hill, testifying before the House Un-American Activities Committee, the Time editor Whittaker Chambers charged that Alger Hiss, president of the Carnegie Foundation and once one of the bright young men of the New Deal, a former official in both the Roosevelt and Truman administrations, serving 14 years in the State Department, had been his accomplice in a communist network. "For a number of years, I myself served in the underground in Washington, D.C., said Chambers. "I knew it at its top level. A member of this group was Alger Hiss." The news rocked the city. Official Washington was described as stunned with anger and disbelief. Speaking off the record, Sam Rayburn told a reporter, "There is political dynamite in this communist investigation. Don't doubt that." But when, at his press conference the following day, Truman was asked whether he thought the spy scare on Capitol Hill was only a red herring to divert public attention from inflation, he said he agreed. "The hearings were a red herring to keep from doing what they ought to do. They are slandering a lot of people that don't deserve it." Could they quote him, reporters asked. Yes, Truman replied, adding further to his troubles. A week later, with the special session of Congress ended, he was fed another line by another reporter, but this time to his benefit. Did he think it had been a do-nothing Congress? Entirely, Truman said. He thought that was quite a good name for the 80th Congress. Upstairs at the White House, the decline and fall of the old building was no longer theoretical. The floor of Margaret's sitting room across the hall from his study had caved in beneath her piano. His own bathroom, the president was informed, was about to collapse. Nothing of this was disclosed, however, nor would it be until after the elections. "Can you imagine what the press would have done with this story?" Margaret would recall. "The whole mess would have been blamed on Harry Truman." Margaret's sitting room floor broke in two but didn't fall through the family dining room ceiling, he reported to his sister on August 10th. "They propped it up and fixed it. Now my bathroom is about to fall into the red parlor. They won't let me sleep in my bedroom or use the bath." He was sleeping in the Lincoln bedroom, in Old Abe's bed, he added, and finding it quite comfortable.